Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1441. The Godly Geniuses. The Grand Sorcerers paled. They had hesitated for a long time before choosing to be patient and let the people on the Divine Kingdom continent off. Their conspiracy was more important compared to killing the people off. So they decided, after a discussion, that they wouldn't fight as long as the people didn't trespass the center of the storm. They just pretended that this had never happened. The warriors that suddenly appeared had extraordinary strength. But they hadn't thought, even in their wildest dreams, that these warriors were, in reality, the godly geniuses. The ancient sorcerer race had lived on the other side of the world for all of eternity, which was why they hadn't seen the illusion battlefield before and hadn't recognized them. If they're godly geniuses, then, not just the celestial position race, I'm afraid even the thoughtless minds, and the Humanity Alliance will pay attention to their every move. The universe was so chaotic that it was almost unimaginable how the Supreme Lords could tolerate the godly geniuses going anywhere far from them. But now that they had dared allow them to come here, they must have had a motive, some cards up their sleeves that they had hidden. This would be big trouble. I knew the people from the pure jade sacred place would cause trouble if they barged into the lower world. But they did barge into this great world and it's my fault. Daly's body was shaking more and more violently. If he had known about it earlier, he would have killed them in the ascending passageway. He shouldn't have worried too much and now, it had led them to one of the most troublesome situations ever. The ancient sorcerer race's methods were scary, and even Daly knew that he had made an unforgivable mistake. He could only imagine the kind of punishment he would have to face. The Supreme Sorcerer snorted. Daly's heart quaked as the Supreme Sorcerer said, "Right now, it is a problem, but also a chance to get rid of the godly geniuses. But the Netherworld crystal towers aren't ready yet. If the Supreme Lords are alerted, wouldn't our efforts be of no use?" Dean objected. Supreme Sorcerer was silent for a moment. He then said, "We can't wait. We don't have enough time. We can only spread out the Netherworld crystal towers in advance." Dean hesitated. "We have arranged 13 Netherworld crystal towers so far and that took us a countless number of years. It's a difficult decision for me to make as well," Supreme Sorcerer said coldly. The two Grand Sorcerers relaxed a little but it looked like the Supreme Sorcerer really didn't have the time to argue with them. "When will we spread them?" Dean asked. "I will give you the instructions before we need to act," Supreme Sorcerer said coldly. The two Grand Sorcerers nodded. They had already understood that the sorcerer race's higher-ups had already moved the plan ahead of schedule. Preston and the others continued to stay in the Divine Kingdom continent, recovering their consumed life vitality while Zen brought Letitia back to the central region. Zen hadn't even imagined that his trip down to the lower world could go this smoothly. It had, in fact, made him suspicious because it shouldn't have been this easy. They traversed the chaotic ocean of stars again. Nathan and Lawson suggested that they should go to the center of the storm and take a look. But Roche and the others stopped them. That storm was too dangerous. Anyone who entered it rashly could probably lose their life. They headed south and soon crossed the chaotic ocean of stars and returned to the central region. Once this matter was resolved, the godly geniuses were required to return to the celestial position and wait for Master Feng's arrangements. But Zen and Letitia hadn't met in a long time, which made it difficult for him to just turn around and leave. Imogen was excited at Letitia's safe return and all her grudges against Zen disappeared. Zen hadn't gone back on his word, after all, and had brought Letitia back safe and sound. Jeffrey had not seen his mother for a while and clung to Letitia like a nimble little monkey. He refused to let her go, afraid that if he did, she would run away. Margaret's mood soured at this, but was also relieved at the thought that Zen couldn't stay in the central region forever. A few days later, there was a great feast at the Cloud Hall. All top figures of the great sects in the central region were attending the feast, reminiscing the old days with Zen. Despite Patrick's and Lewis' cultivation levels being relatively low, they were both placed in the front. The atmosphere at the banquet was quite warm. Everyone in the central region was curious about the people around Zen. "Zen, may we have the honor of knowing who the almighty beings around you are?" Dylan said, smiling a loopy smile, now that he was a little drunk. Zen nodded. He hadn't introduced all of them yet and no one from the central region had heard of them. So he introduced them by name, one by one. They were already familiar with Roche and Margaret. As he introduced each of others, Lone, Lucille and Kurt stood up and greeted everyone, acknowledging Zen's introduction. The strength and status of those people around them might not be worth mentioning, but they were still Zen's friends. But Nathan and Lawson behaved as if they hadn't heard Zen. Nathan even looked away from him, making it even more awkward. Zen didn't care. He hadn't expected Nathan and Lawson to come with him. He was disappointed that they were acting so smugly, but because the universe was in such a crisis, he knew that he couldn't treat these two men as his enemies. Chapter 1442, An Unnoticed Talent. These two friends don't seem to be in a good mood. Dylan, a clever and considerate man, said in an attempt to help Zen make the situation less uncomfortable. However, Nathan replied coldly, "I'm drinking with a bunch of ants from the lower world. How do you expect me to be in a good mood?" Many of those who heard the response found it insulting. Various strong masters from all over the central region had come to visit the Cloud Hall. Said during this glorious and joyous occasion, Nathan's words offended some people. Letitia made a face at Zen, who frowned and snapped, "If my hospitality has failed to please the two of you, then you can leave." They had all relied on Zen's teleportation token to get here. They could go back to the upper world through the ascending passageway, but through there was no guarantee that they would return safely. Lawson curled his lips. He ignored Zen, and when he spoke, it was to support Nathan. What was wrong with what Nathan said? Martial artists from the lower world don't even compare to ants, and that's a fact. From the perspective of these top warriors, this was an accepted truth. If it weren't for Zen, they wouldn't have had any connection with the lower world. Really, why is it, then, that as the #1 godly genius in the universe, you still lost to Zen? Margaret snapped. She could no longer sit there and watch this senseless argument go on. Among the people who the two had referred to as ants were members of her family. Today, Xander had even brought the core members of the ethereal spirit sect to the banquet. Margaret saw herself as someone who often caused trouble without reason. Today, she discovered that these two fellows from the thoughtless minds were even more unreasonable than she was. HMPH, he's simply an exception, a special ant, Nathan snorted. Deep inside, he also did not understand how someone like Zen had found his way into this great world. Nurturing an ace talent or a godly genius required plenty of resources. From the looks of it, the central region was not the kind of place to catch the eye or produce outstanding talents. Zen coming from such a place defied logic. What about me? Am I an exception, too? Margaret raised an eyebrow. I wonder how many exceptions there are in the central region, Roche said. Among the top 10 warriors of the Supreme Worlds, the central region nurtured 3. Despite the power of the thoughtless minds, they were only able to secure the same number of places, 3 out of 10. For a moment, Nathan was at a loss for words. To their surprise, Kurt, who had been silently enjoying a selection of vegetarian dishes the whole time, smiled and chimed in, "Amitabha, the central region is truly too mystical. It takes 3 places in the heavens. A talent of our blessed Buddha land even stays here, still unnoticed." Everyone looked curiously at Kurt. Nobody knew what he meant. Lewis and Patrick drank in silence. The low tables, each accommodating 3 to 5 people, were lined up in a single row. Lewis, Patrick, and Roche shared the same table, and all 3 sat above the salt. Lewis and Patrick's friendship with Zen and Roche had granted them seats of honor in the banquet. Their strength and status alone didn't make them qualified to sit where they were. Upon hearing the conversations between Zen and the others, Patrick and Lewis were shocked to the core. How big was the universe? The two had never seen it before, but from what Roche had said, there were trillions of Soul Sea Realm warriors out there. Trillions. When they heard this, they were so astonished that they almost fell to the ground. In comparison, there were much fewer Soul Sea Realm warriors in this great world. The real power of the universe seemed to be beyond their imagination. They had just found out, from what Zen had said, that these people were the top godly geniuses in the entire universe. At the time, they didn't know what the title of godly genius meant. Nevertheless, to be able to stand out among trillions of Soul Sea Realm cultivators and be among the top 10 indicated that their talents were beyond astonishing. All of a sudden, a strange feeling overcame Patrick. He felt like someone was watching him. When he looked around, he found out that Kurt was staring at him. Now that he thought about it, he was sure that Kurt had been staring at him the whole time. The realization sent chills down his spine. When Zen had led this group away to rescue Letitia, this monk had stared at him the same way. Why was he doing it again? Kurt gazed at Patrick, who was deep in thought about why this was happening. One by one, the group seemed to notice. Everyone followed Kurt's gaze until, in the end, all their gazes landed on Patrick. Hey, your companion is gazing at you again, Lewis teased as he elbowed Patrick in the arm. Curse you, he's your companion, not mine. Patrick hated it when people stared, especially when they did it in this manner, but Lewis' remark made him feel even worse. He couldn't help but curse him. Lewis, on the other hand, was amused, but when he, too, could tell that Patrick was already feeling a little nervous, he decided to keep quiet. Kurt, what do you mean by that? A hint of curiosity flashed on Zen's face. After ascending to the upper world, Zen had never entered the blessed Buddha land. The Buddhism they practiced there was unusual, and some parts of it were quite mysterious. He had a feeling that there was something behind Kurt's words. Kurt smiled and nodded at Patrick. May I know your name, Mr. Patrick Pay? Patrick stood up and put his palms together as a form of salute. Some might have found this strange, as Kurt looked like a little acolyte. He was even younger than Patrick was. However, he was still a spirit supreme realm warrior. Thus, Patrick politely paid him due respect. After Patrick had greeted him with a salute, Kurt did the same and put his palms together. He said, Amitabha, you are the reincarnation of the Akalanatha, but right now, you have a very slim chance of ascending to the upper world. If you come to our blessed Buddha land, we will train you and mold you into a godly genius. Without waiting for a response, Kurt turned to Zen and Letitia. I wonder, if I want to take someone away from the Cloud Hall, will you permit me to do so? He asked. Chapter 1443, Secret. The other godly geniuses despised the Cloud Hall. A 6th grade sect, or even a 10th grade sacred place was nothing in their eyes. The forces they were under had jurisdiction over thousands of 10th grade sacred places. So it was a surprise that Kurt was exceedingly polite and asked the Cloud Hall for a warrior. Zen's eyebrows were raised. Godly genius. Letitia's eyes also flashed. She wasn't a stranger to how things worked around the upper world. Ever since she ascended, Preston had already filled her in on the different levels of strength in the universe along with the different types of geniuses among warriors. Godly geniuses were definitely the cream of the crop. They were the ones considered as the most talented and remarkable warriors in the entire universe due to their power and rarity. Letitia was rendered speechless for a moment. Her Cloud Hall was simply too powerful now that it had 3 godly geniuses. It might even be much stronger than she had ever expected. So how would it be graded? Was it an 11th grade sacred place? Or a 21st grade sacred place? None of the people from the central region really knew what godly genius meant. All they knew was that Patrick had been chosen by this monk of the Spirit Supreme Realm, so that must meant that he was very talented. At that moment, they viewed Patrick as at least a divine-level talent. However, Nathan and the others were visibly surprised. Cultivating him into a godly genius. Kurt, can you really make such a major decision on behalf of the Hidden Spirit Temple? Are you joking? Nathan laughed. All of the godly geniuses were aware of their high status. They were symbolic of the future of their respective forces. Yet here was Kurt, randomly handpicking a warrior from the lower world with the goal of turning him into a godly genius. Kurt, however, merely smiled. Have you ever seen a monk lie or say something reckless? The Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment has done so before, Lawson said. The Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment pertained to the strongest Supreme Lord in the blessed Buddha land. That has nothing to do with me, Kurt replied, not really finding the need to argue with these 2 warriors anymore. He turned his gaze back at Letitia. I would like to ask Cloud Hall's permission to take him away. Patrick was bound to be taken to the blessed Buddha land anyway no matter what Letitia said. Kurt had to naturally report this talent he had found to the Hidden Spirit Temple which would then, in turn, do everything in its power to take Patrick away. Kurt, however, saw the need to ask for Letitia's opinion first for formality's sake. Meanwhile, Patrick himself was still unsure as to what was currently happening. He had wanted to enter a temple in the past but there just weren't many powerful ones in the central region and most of the cultivation techniques weren't even suitable for him. All he could do was to rely on his own comprehension. His cultivation had reached the virtual tribulation realm which made him the core strength of Cloud Hall though this was still a far cry from Roche's and Zen's level. Letitia smiled graciously. Although Patrick is a disciple of Cloud Hall, I will not stop him if he has a better place to go to. Please ask him first if he agrees. Before Patrick could even say anything, Lewis already beat him to it. What is a godly genius? I'll ask this question on his behalf. There are 3,000 godly ways in the universe. A so-called godly genius is someone who has the capacity to become a true god in the future, go beyond the universe and surpass the supreme lords. I cannot guarantee that Patrick will reach this level, but the reincarnation of Akalanatha. Kurt trailed off and refused to finish his words. What is a supreme lord? Lewis asked once again. A lower world warrior had no clear concept of immortality, so this was an opportunity for Lewis to gain knowledge and satisfy his own curiosity. A supreme lord is someone who carries the heavenly destiny, an invincible being in the universe, Kurt answered truthfully. What is second to a supreme lord? Lewis continued. His incessant questioning annoyed even the patient Kurt. Roche and Patrick had already rolled their eyes with his questions. If you want to know the division of power among the warriors within this universe, I can tell you in private, Kurt replied curtly. Lewis laughed. I've finished my questions. Ha ha. Zen couldn't help but look at Patrick with a smile. This opportunity was extremely hard to obtain for any warrior and he believed that Patrick was in no way going to let this pass. Just as he expected, Patrick cupped his hands in greeting. I am willing to go with Kurt. He knew that his choice would lead to a tremendous change in his future, though he couldn't imagine just how big it was going to be just yet. Nathan and Lawson were once again driven speechless. Their thoughts were in complete disarray. Just what kind of cursed place was this great world? Why was it so mystical? The world of chaos arrived and there were only about 10 godly geniuses. Nearly half of them came from this great world. It didn't make sense, statistically speaking. Most of the warriors present felt incredible envy grip their hearts at this wonderful opportunity that presented itself in front of Patrick. Their cultivation levels were not high, but they were wise enough to know that these experts had extremely special backgrounds. Patrick was only a virtual tribulation realm warrior, but he now had the chance to enter the universe. With this out of the way, they all continued with the banquet. As everyone enjoyed themselves, a hairline space crack suddenly appeared on the other side of Cloudy City where rays of green light burst forth. A green shadow drilled out from the space crack and from it emerged the supreme sorcerer of the sorcerer race. He raised the jade bone cane in his hand and waved it in the air wherein a green incantation circle appeared. The godly geniuses were currently gathered here. If he could kill all of them at this place, all at once, then that would be a good thing for the sorcerer race. He had to be wary though. These godly geniuses were most likely being protected by the members of the celestial position in secret. So this time, he had to go all out and use a devastating method that he was sure would eliminate all of them. Chapter 1444, Ghost Faces. The instant the green incantations appeared, dozens of sinister-looking ghost faces appeared. They projected a greenish hue and looked terrifying as they drifted towards the cloud hall. The enchanted barrier that was named Light of Water was enough to block the space law to a certain extent. But the ghost faces could easily cross over it. The ancient sorcerer race was not so good at open battle. Even though this supreme sorcerer's cultivation was weak as compared to a supreme lord, he could still use powerful spells. The supreme sorcerer floated in midair, looking around with his two peculiar eyes revealing only the whites. For the time being, he was focusing on controlling the ghost faces as they silently drifted back and forth in the Cud Hall. At the same time, the supreme sorcerer was also aware about his surroundings. He was keeping an alert eye on the activities happening below him. He was surprised to see that the celestial position race allowed these kids to come here without any defenses around them. With this careless action, he easily had an advantage over them. Whoosh, little kids, I found you. The supreme sorcerer mocked at the godly geniuses by pointing at their direction. Immediately the ghost faces turned towards that direction at the same time. The ghost faces were constantly shuttling and they illuminated like giant fireflies in the dark night. What a sight. These ghastly faces did not have a fixed shape. The moment they entered, they rushed towards Zen and the others. Zen was the first to react. As soon as he saw the ghost faces, he went on instant alert. Quickly he grabbed Letitia by her waist and pulled her away. He could not figure out the strength of these ghost faces. Sensing their evil aura emanating from them, he instantly went on guard. One of the ghost faces accidentally brushed against a warrior of the virtual tribulation realm. That fraction of contact was enough to freeze the warrior's body. He opened his mouth to scream but no sound came out. And just like that his body went limp with the look of fear etched across his face. Seeing this horror, the entire hall went in an uproar. There was panic everywhere with people running around without any sense of direction. What just happened? Quick, retreat. Such a cruel way to exercise power. We are doomed. Soon all the warriors started dropping dead like flies. Within seconds, many warriors were slain mercilessly. There was such panic among the people right now. Zen and the others looked with dismay at the scene unfolding before their eyes. They definitely wouldn't be able to withstand such strange and fast attacks from the enemies, let alone fight against them. We are no match for this force. They can take our lives without showing up. Retreat back to the fairy palace. Zen immediately thought. With Letitia by his side, they both could be safe. But what about Jeffrey? He was still in the cloud hall with Imogen. In his moment of hesitation, one of the ghost faces had already pounced on Zen. The situation was similar for Kurt, Lucille, Nathan and others. The godly geniuses were already surrounded by their enemies. You go in first. At this moment, Zen already had the token of mountain in his hand. However, his priority was to ensure that Letitia and Margaret got safely into the palace. As for Freya, Zen could not reach out to her as she was positioned far away. However, if this was the case, then Roche and others might be in danger, too. Zen was clueless as to how to deal with this crisis. He knew that his return back to the lower world would not be that easy, but he did not anticipate such methods from the sorcerer race. He had no idea on how to fight it back. Suddenly, everyone froze in their actions. The wine cups and saucers that had been placed on the square tables froze in midair. The droplets from the cups also remained suspended in a similar way. The flickering light from the candles ceased its movement. All of a sudden, time had stopped for everyone. One could see a middle-aged warrior wearing long gray robe, sitting in the center of the hall. Zen had earlier been acquainted with this warrior. He was present when he had his blood exchanged and was a supreme lord of celestial position. As he flicked his hand, a series of lightning thunderbolts shot out from his fingertips. Bang, bang, the power that shot out from his fingertips did not seem very powerful, especially to a supreme lord who possessed the power to destroy the world. But for the moment it was more than enough, for one by one the ghost faces started dropping dead. After all the ghost faces were slain, the time that had stood still seemed to flow back in action. Up until now, nobody really knew about the Supreme Lord's control over the time law. The scene played before their eyes in a slow motion, including their thoughts. Because of this, the crowd couldn't see the Supreme Lord's attack. All they could see was a blurred vision of the whole action. The Supreme Lord turned his head and smiled at Zen and the others. Come out, you little brats. It is time to go back. We are eternally grateful, Supreme Lord Mirage, for saving our lives, Roche said, folding his hands with respect. Zen also followed suit and folded his hands in gratitude. He still could not shake off the feeling that they were so close to death. There were so many people in Cloud Hall who were relying on him and he nearly failed them. He realized that the celestial position was still not very confident about their group and had arranged for a Supreme Lord to protect them. I wonder who dared to attack us. Nathan's expression had turned sour. He knew that he had been implicated by Zen and he was very furious with that. He should have listened to his instincts and not followed him then. Supreme Lord Mirage just waved his hand and said indifferently, that's just a certain supreme sorcerer who will be in trouble now. Chapter 1445, A Big Trouble. The supreme sorcerer, who was standing outside the Cloud Hall, sensed the danger. The soul-devouring shadow he had released was killed, and just as his face clouded with anger, a soft voice rang out. I've discovered you too. A white figure appeared by the supreme sorcerer's side. The supreme sorcerer felt the cold blade of a sword against his neck. Go to perdition, the wielder of the sword said angrily, without hesitation. The short sword suddenly blossomed into a strong ray of light and made its way towards the supreme sorcerer. The supreme sorcerer's sparkling body spread out suddenly, transforming into a glow of green light that scattered crazily everywhere. But before anyone could react, the green light went up to gather above the clouds. When the green light had condensed back into the body of the supreme sorcerer, there was a wound on his neck that looked like it could not be healed. In the darkness of the night, green blood gushed out from the wound. It was evident that the sword had struck him hard. Just as his body began to congeal, the white figure appeared behind the supreme sorcerer like a shadow. He slashed out again with the short sword in his hand. The supreme sorcerer's expression shifted. He transformed into a number of green lights and scattered in all directions, flying into the back of space this time. The white figure sneered and followed them into the space. It was a battle between two supreme beings. The explosive power that erupted could destroy the heavens and earth. Even a massive supreme world couldn't withstand it, much less this great world. The white figure followed the supreme sorcerer every time he condensed. Swoosh, die. The white figure waved the exquisite short sword in his hand, causing a sword light to flash off of it. The sword light spiraled, turned into an 8-diagram wheel, and headed towards the supreme sorcerer. Now that they were on the other side of the world and the white figure had nothing to worry about, he released his full power. The power of the sword light was overwhelming. The sword light penetrated the Supreme Sorcerer's body, and emerged from his back. It gradually disappeared, but not before it had reached tens of millions of miles. From afar, the sword light looked as bright as the Milky Way, cutting through the night. He had been executing this strike in the void. If this sword strike were to be used in the central region, it could cut apart the great world and reach the end of the world. It could even break through the barrier of the great world and pass through the connected great world. Green blood gushed out. The Supreme Sorcerer was obviously injured, but he did not show his fear. He only looked at the white figure and said, "I was wondering who it was." Supreme Lord Sky. How could your ancient sorcerer race kill the godly geniuses under the protection of my celestial position? Supreme Lord Sky said. The exquisite sword in his hand glinted dangerously. The celestial position race never thought much of the ancient sorcerer race, even though the ancient sorcerers were a little troublesome for them. Celestial position could crush them easily. For celestial position, the real danger came from their enemies behind the sighing wall. Is that so? The Supreme Sorcerer laughed coldly. Since Supreme Lord Sky has arrived, the one who extinguished my soul-devouring shadow in the hall should be Supreme Lord Mirage. I wonder if Supreme Lord Mirage can beat Torch Dragon. Ha ha. This Supreme Sorcerer knew that the celestial position had prepared a backup plan. Under these circumstances, he still dared kill the godly geniuses, which meant that he naturally had a backup plan too. At this, Supreme Lord Sky narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "You've already awakened the Torch Dragon. You are so ambitious." Chapter 1446. A Formidable Grand Sorcerer. At the same time, in the hall, Supreme Lord Mirage said to Zen, "That Supreme Sorcerer is going to be in deep trouble." As he finished speaking, a space crack exploded. An inky black tail glided out from it, instantly coiled around Supreme Lord Mirage and pulled him into the back of the space. The chaotic situation had finally stabilized thanks to the arrival of Supreme Lord Mirage. Normally, with the two Supreme Lords present, the sorcerer race would not dare to make another move. So no one expected the situation to change so soon. Zen and the others were also stunned by this sudden phenomenon. In reality, the celestial position had foreseen this when they allowed Zen and the others to leave. That was exactly why they had sent the two Supreme Lords to protect them from the sorcerer race. The sorcerer race itself was not particularly powerful in the universe, but they were suddenly invading many supreme worlds in order to wake up fierce beasts from remote ages. It was not like the sorcerer race wanted to conquer the supreme worlds, but the beasts from remote ages were all hidden in the depths of certain supreme worlds. This was the main reason why they wanted to seize these supreme worlds. Supreme Lord Mirage and Supreme Lord Sky were quietly guarding Zen and the rest, and before the Supreme Sorcerer could make his move, they had already launched their counterattack. However, the two Supreme Lords did not expect the sorcerer race to also come prepared for a war. The Torch Dragon, also known as Candle Dragon, was originally a variant of the genuine dragon. It was a sacred beast in the upper world, possessing strength comparable to a genuine dragon. The two Supreme Lords fought valiantly with a Supreme Sorcerer and a Torch Dragon on the back of this great world. Back in the hall, the faces of the people from the central region turned pale as everybody was shell-shocked. Naturally, the 8 godly geniuses were also aghast. In the battle between the Supreme Lords and the Supreme Sorcerer, if the people got swept away in the aftermath of the collision, they would be crushed like butterflies in a storm. In every war, collateral damage was inevitable. Fortunately, the sorcerer race preferred to hide in the shadows of the world. So they had drawn the two Supreme Lords into the back of the space. If they were to fight in the sky above the Cloud Hall, the entire central region would probably be annihilated in an instant. "Zen, take us back now," Nathan yelled immediately. "Yes, take us back to the celestial position," or the Lai clan, added Lawson. From their point of view, this was a very dangerous place and a hostile environment, so naturally, they wanted to flee at the first chance they got. They thought that they were not responsible for the great world turning upside down. Lucille and the rest also showed a desire to escape. To put it bluntly, these 8 people were countless times more important than the warriors in this great world. The truth was that there still was another way of leaving this great world, and that was to nullify the effects of the moon-shrouding stone so that the great world would expel them from it. In other words, they would be able to ascend into the upper world. However, there was uncertainty about which channel of the supreme world to enter. Who knew which supreme world they would be transported to? Suppose the supreme world they landed in was suffering the invasion of the sorcerer race, it would be a dead end for them. Only Zen's miraculous teleportation token could allow them to return safely. It seemed to be the most foolproof method. Zen's gaze flickered constantly. Nathan's suggestion was not wrong. Fleeing the situation was the correct thing to do right now. They could come up with an alternate strategy with regards to the sorcerers later. As godly geniuses, the most important beings of the universe, they bore the responsibility of saving the universe, as well as fulfilling the ardent expectations of the Supreme Lords. However, Zen was not going to stand by and watch his homeland being completely obliterated by these nasty creatures. Whoosh! Noticing Zen's hesitation, Nathan took out a spear and held it against Zen's forehead, and goaded him, now. Zen kept his cool and his expression did not change at all. He looked around at the warriors of the central region's various sects, and found that all of them had a bitter expression on their faces. They knew that this disaster was brought about by Zen and they would loathe him for it if he chose to just leave. However, in this place, these people were as insignificant as ants. At the moment, their pleas to Zen to stay did not hold any weight. This group of masters at the Spirit Supreme Realm were so desperate to avoid the disaster that even Zen couldn't stop them. Zen realized there was no use wasting time in any more debates with them. He flicked his finger and the teleportation token popped out from his space ring. Whoever wants to leave can do so on their own. I am going to stay here anyway, he declared. He had devised a brilliant plan in his mind. The others could enter the teleportation token while he placed Letitia, Jeffrey and the rest in the fairy palace. But before Zen could activate the teleportation token, a cold voice rang out. Haha, none of you can leave. Chapter 1447, Smoky Heart-Locking Curse. Everyone in the crowd gasped as they saw the sky crack. Time seemed to stop as a black figure emerged from within the fissure and as the figure slowly stepped into the light, they saw his body covered with jagged barbs. It's a grand sorcerer. His cultivation level is that of a warlord's. Zen, hurry and activate that thing of yours. Take us out of here. Lawson roared. I already said none of you can leave and yet you still try. The Grand Sorcerer's voice boomed as he brandished his bone cane. Black mist rose from the tip of the cane, which then shot straight to Zen's group, striking 8 people in the chest. Ah, you can try to escape. The Grand Sorcerer began, but I must tell you, it will be futile. Your hearts will explode before you can leave this place. This was the smoky heart-locking curse from the ancient sorcerer race. Unless the person who cast the curse was killed, the black fog would never be lifted. At this point, it was as powerful as the desperate melee. The only catch was that its power depended on the person who cast the spell. Unfortunately for them, this grand sorcerer clearly believed he had the power to crush all 8 godly geniuses. Let's get rid of him first. Someone shouted, leave the cloud hall. Another screamed. With a flash of light, Rocher summoned the soaring snake sword as he dashed toward the grand sorcerer. The warriors who had come to visit the cloud hall were in chaos. None of them thought they'd be involved in a battle with this level and magnitude. All they could do was run and try to escape in panic. At the moment Rocher spoke. However, the Grand Sorcerer was not interested in the ordinary warriors. All of his attention was directed towards the 8 godly geniuses. Evacuate everyone in the Cloud Hall, then leave this place with Jeffrey. Zen instructed before charging after Rocher. At the same time, Lucille, Kurt, and Lone also unleashed their own techniques on the sorcerer. Unable to stand in the background, Nathan and Lawson gritted their teeth and rushed forward. Although almost all of these 8 godly geniuses were in the Spirit Supreme Realm, it wasn't impossible for them to defeat Spirit Transformation Realm warriors. Which meant that while this Grand Sorcerer had the power of a warlord, and the chances were slim, if the 8 geniuses united, they could actually defeat the sorcerer. A blinding beam of light shot to where the Grand Sorcerer was standing and Rocher suddenly appeared at the end. Like lightning, he thrust his soaring snake sword forward. Hey, the Grand Sorcerer scowled. You deserve your reputation. He lightly tapped his cane on his palm and with a sudden swing, a black demonic claw formed and grabbed at the soaring snake sword. Clang! The force of the sword colliding with the claw sent Rocher back. None of them knew what the claw was, but it must have been very strong if even the soaring snake sword was unable to cut through it. Go to perdition. The Grand Sorcerer sneered and spun his bone cane in a circle, the shadow of an insect emerging from its tip and crawling towards Rocher. This was the deadly cane strike of the sorcerer race. One hit meant instant death. This was how merciless the sorcerer race was in taking lives. In your dreams, Rocher shouted, narrowly evading the attack. Zen rushed toward the Grand Sorcerer as the power of his dragon scales was activated. Zen was like an ancient beast from Savage Land. Right now, under Zen's hit, even a world lord would not be able to handle this power, not to mention a Grand Sorcerer whose race wasn't good at hand-to-hand combat. Having no choice but to give up killing Rocher at the moment, the sorcerer waved his cane causing more black claws to emerge from the black fog surrounding him. Two of the claws turned into fists and shot toward Zen. Puff, puff. With two muffled sounds, Zen turned the two black claws into smoke. The power contained in them, however, was much more than what Zen expected, and the force caused him to be blown back a good 5 feet from where he was. Lucille, Lone, and Nathan followed Zen's lead and launched their first round of attacks. While they were itching to leave this place already, they were still chained by the smoky heart-locking curse and needed to kill the Grand Sorcerer first. Boom! The Cloud Hall, which was floating high up in the sky, suddenly began to shake violently. Although they had focused all their power on the Grand Sorcerer, his power was still too great. In the end, the Cloud Hall was not able to resist such terrifying power and threatened to fall apart. Nathan's spear missed and flipped over the roof and flew over to the enchanted barrier of the light of water. In the past, Eddie was naturally helpless against the enchanted barrier of the light of water, but when Nathan marched his spear forward, the enchanted barrier began to ripple and crack. And before the power of the spear light could spread throughout the barrier, the whole light of water shattered. Chapter 1448, Destruction. Shaky and anxious murmurs filled the night air as the cloudy city was in deep danger. Heavy footsteps clanked continuously on the pavement. Under Letitia's order, all the warriors were quickly evacuated. High up in the sky, numerous martial artists from the Cloud Hall poured out of the exits. The Cloud Hall looked like a broken bag of rice when viewed from the cloudy city, as countless martial artists scattered like rice grains in various directions. Just then, the shaking in the Cloud Hall intensified. The mortals in the central region viewed the Cloud Hall as something of a colossus, an aerial edifice that would never sink. However, Letitia and the others in the Cloud Hall knew very well that the Grand Sorcerer or the Spirit Supreme Realm warriors could completely destroy the Cloud Hall with only one move. "Where's Dad? Why don't I see him?" Jeffrey said. He leaned on Imogen's back in thought while the latter hoisted him up further on her back. Even at his young age, he knew what the panic on the faces of the many warriors in the Cloud Hall meant. He understood that the supposedly fortified place was now in deep trouble. "Don't worry, your father will be fine," Imogen reassured him. However, she too was quite worried deep inside. The Cloud Hall was important to her and she had put a lot of energy and effort towards its development, only for Zen to bring it so much problems. Although Imogen felt upset, she was also worried about Zen. After all, he was the only one who had contributed the most to the Cloud Hall and helped it become the top sect in the central region. But after Zen had ascended to the upper world, he would have surely gotten himself into trouble. Now, the trouble he had faced was far more than what the Cloud Hall could handle. At this moment, the Cloud Hall was like a mere mosquito that the almighty warriors of the upper world could easily crush. Aside from the Cloud Hall, all the city gates of the cloudy city were open and all the transmission arrays had been lit up overnight. Everyone in the third-grade clans, all the forces of the World Commercial Alliance, and even the common mortals hurriedly moved out of the city. This time, the battle was as fierce as Zen had never felt before. His opponents were like jungle beasts against them, who were like mere ants. It was no secret that many innocent lives might be lost during the fight. Boom! A blinding bolt of light loudly shot towards the sky, and the Cloud Hall suddenly shook and tilted to the side. Fortunately, the Cloud Hall was on a huge floating rock. It would still stay afloat even if it were to be toppled or rolled around. Meanwhile, Letitia got distracted from evacuating the warriors when she saw the scene. Her worried gaze drifted to the peak of Cloud Hall, and she sighed. If the Cloud Hall was destroyed, it could be rebuilt. As long as the foundation was still there, she wouldn't care even if she had to abandon this piece of floating stone. She just hoped that nothing bad happened to Zen. Yet, she only got more worried as she thought about it. She paused for a moment and thought about returning to the Cloud Hall. "Tia, what are you doing?" Imogen's loud voice cut through Letitia's ears. Letitia's gaze flickered as she said, "I want to go and take a look. It's useless for you to watch or meddle in a high-level battle. What would Zen think if you lost your life just like that?" Imogen said coldly. She knew that Letitia was stubborn, so she had no choice but to be a little tougher on her. Letitia was silent. She clearly knew that she wasn't of much help, but she couldn't help but feel envious of Margaret. Margaret's talent enabled her to help Zen, while Letitia couldn't. "Zen is too lucky. A man with such great fortune wouldn't die so easily," Imogen said in a softer voice. Her words made Letitia feel a bit more at ease, even if Zen was no longer the same as before. Back then, Zen could still survive a fight even when he was faced against someone stronger than him. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Just then, a streak of black light from the top of the Cloud Hall shot into the sky, and then beams of light followed. Swash! At that moment, a sharp sword light pierced through the air like a meteor as it gradually expanded. It quickly flew towards the side of Cloudy City and landed on a patch of wilderness at the city's outskirts. Soon enough, the whole ground began to quake. Rumble. It turned out that Lone was behind that sword strike. Back then in the painting, each move made by a godly genius against their opponent could almost destroy the whole board. However, it was completely different now. If they launched an attack, they could cause mountain landslides, tsunamis, and mass destruction. The sword strike landed somewhere in the wilderness and caused the ground to roll up. Mounds of soil sputtered up and formed a mountain of about 1,000 feet tall. However, the sword light's momentum wasn't decreasing anytime soon as it continued downwards on the side of Cloudy City, leaving a crack over 100 miles long in its wake. In turn, the underground river was split in half. The strong currents washed over the two sides of the rocky crevice and formed numerous large caves, while the animals underground fled away at the sudden impact. It was also Lone's this sword strike that would create a huge canyon in the future. The Cloud Hall faced upwards again after it rolled. Meanwhile, the martial artists of Cloud Hall and Cloudy City were deeply relieved to see the powerful warriors get further and further away from them. They silently hoped that the warriors would never come back again. Up high in the sky, Zen led the charge and was engaged in a fight with the Grand Sorcerer. It was because he was the only one who could withstand the Ghost Claw's attacks. Of the 8 godly geniuses, 7 of them were at the Spirit Supreme Realm, while Margaret was at the Soul Sea Realm. Even though the 8 of them had joined forces to fight the Grand Sorcerer who was as strong as a world lord, it was barely enough to keep their opponent at bay. At the same time, the long fight rendered the sorcerer unable to kill any of the godly geniuses. Naturally, the Grand Sorcerer was secretly shocked. According to his previous judgment, he should have been able to defeat these Spirit Supreme Realm warriors with his power, as the Torch Dragon and the Supreme Sorcerer handled the 2 Supreme Lords. Thus, he had confidently unleashed the Smoky Heart-locking curse. But he never thought that these warriors at the Spirit Supreme Realm would be so remarkable. They were godly geniuses after all, and the godly ways that they cultivated gave them too much support. Fire filled Nathan's eyes as he launched consecutive attacks. Go to perdition, he screamed furiously. Before, he thought that he shouldn't follow Zen and would not get involved in this mess. Yet, he struck his spear towards the Grand Sorcerer's body like it was a poisonous snake. Luckily, he had cultivated the Law Spear Strike, which helped him see through everything. But because of the limitations of his cultivation base, he only found a few flaws on the Grand Sorcerer. Then again he was Nathan, so a single strike was enough. As long as he successfully aimed at the Sorcerer's flaw, even the Grand Sorcerer at the World Lord realm would undoubtedly die. Shock was written all over the Grand Sorcerer's face as he faced Nathan's pointed spear. These godly geniuses certainly had strange but powerful cultivation methods. If he hadn't returned to the Spirit Transformation realm due to suppression of his own cultivation realm, he probably wouldn't compare to any of them. It could be said that Nathan's attack was the most lethal among the 8 godly geniuses. He seemed to be able to see through the Grand Sorcerer's vital points. His spear strike was nothing to a world lord, but the Grand Sorcerer felt like he was on the verge of death in the face of the spear's actual attack. This is too dangerous. I have to kill this brat first. With that thought in mind, he waved the bone cane in his hand and a bit of black fog was diffused. His body immediately disappeared into the black fog, and simultaneously dodged Nathan's spear strike. He has made use of this move again. Everyone, be careful. Even amidst a crisis, Zen and the others reminded one another. If only they were faced with an ordinary world lord, they would have had a chance to claim victory in this battle. The key point was that this sorcerer race used really odd methods. Their cultivation methods weren't derived from a variety of laws. That combined with their strange cultivation methods made them difficult to defeat. Swoosh! Suddenly, the black fog froze and appeared behind Nathan. The Grand Sorcerer stretched out the bone cane in his hand, and punctured Nathan's back. You should be the one to die, brat. Deadly cane strike. An insect shadow gushed out of the bone cane's tip. This kind of strange insect was known as the Nether Spring Cicada, which was said to have been caught from the Nether World and could only be used by the Sorcerer race's Grand Sorcerer. Each Grand Sorcerer's cane was specially designed by the Sorcerer race, and was equipped with 7 Nether Spring Cicadas. If the cane struck a warrior, the Nether Spring Cicada could enter the body. Once it had done so, not even a true god would be able to save them. Thus, the cane strike was called the Deadly Cane Strike, and it resulted in one's immediate death. Since the Grand Sorcerer's attack happened so suddenly just as when Nathan was about to attack, he was caught off guard. The flaw was seemingly endless and he didn't have enough time to dodge. Idiot, dang it, Zen brought me so much trouble. Nathan mentally cursed Zen. Chapter 1449, Chasing After the Grand Sorcerer. Nathan was harboring a deep resentment towards Zen. Even though he was facing a life and death moment, he couldn't push back his feelings of anger for the other man. In fact, it seemed like he couldn't care less about his own life and death. How dare you? Do you know who he is? Lawson reprimanded. The magical light of 5 elements flashed as Lucille's killing intent surged within her beautiful eyes. These 3 warriors came from the same great force. After all, they had special status. No one had ever thought they would perish here. Seeing the Grand Sorcerer thrusting out his cane, Lawson couldn't help but blurt out the question. Lawson's threat might have worked if they were facing other forces. Being the descendant of Supreme Lord of Original Sin, if Nathan was killed, the person who killed him would undoubtedly meet their own death. But to the Grand Sorcerer, such a threat only sounded ridiculous. The sorcerer race was fighting against the entire universe, something they had plotted for hundreds of millions of years. How could he possibly fear Supreme Lord of Original Sin? And this time, the purpose of his attack was to exterminate these 8 godly geniuses. The moment the shadow of the insect on the tip of the cane rushed towards Nathan, a figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Zen. The scene left Margaret stunned, but she was unable to stop it. All happened so fast and it was too late for her to stop it. Kurt, Rocher, and all the others were then wearing different expressions. None of them were expecting Zen to block the attack on Nathan. Even Nathan was looking at him strangely. Boom. The white jade cane struck Zen's fist. The nether spring cicada attached to the tip of the cane flashed a black light that got into Zen's fist. It was an extremely powerful creature. If it were to get into someone's body, it could extinguish the person's life energy in an instant. Even a world lord would fall to death under the cicada's power. Seeing that he had succeeded, the Grand Sorcerer sneered. Then, he turned into black smoke and dodged Lawson's and Lucille's attacks before reappearing a dozen feet away. Although he had been fighting with the kids for quite a long time, these godly geniuses would eventually die in his hands, one after another. With this in mind, the process of killing them was something he could enjoy. Before long, Zen's life energy would be devoured completely. He'd end up a living corpse before perishing into nothing. Zen. Margaret rushed over to Zen's side, her heart aching in concern. The battle between the two sides froze for a minute. But then everyone's eyes focused on Zen as they waited for death to come. Only Zen remained expressionless as he stared at the Grand Sorcerer. Then, he smiled. After a moment, the sneer on the Grand Sorcerer's face turned into a look of disbelief. As for Lucille, Margaret, and the rest, their expressions of sorrow turned to joy. This is impossible, the Grand Sorcerer roared. Being a Grand Sorcerer of the Sorcerer race, he was well aware of how terrifying the Nether Spring Cicada was. The Nether Spring Cicada was one of the famous magical insects of the race. It was extremely powerful. The move wouldn't be called the Deadly Cane Strike if anyone could be left unaffected after the insect made its way into their body. These godly geniuses had indeed stepped into the godly way, but this didn't make them invincible. The Sorcerer race originated from the Divine Land and the Grand Sorcerer was left at a loss. He couldn't fathom the idea that Zen was still alive. Still, Zen wasn't completely unaffected. The small insect that had entered Zen's body left him in shock. He could feel his own life energy madly gushing out of his body. If he continued to lose his life energy at such a speed, his life energy would run out in a minute. But in just an instant, Zen began transferring the power he had received. Zen himself had no good impression of Nathan. The two, Nathan and Lawson, seemed to be fond of spouting nonsense, which made Zen feel even more hateful. But the 10 warriors in the heavens had already been decided. Even Nathan couldn't accept this fact. Still, he had to admit Zen's identity just as Zen had to accept his. He couldn't possibly let the guy die here. As he fought in this great world, Zen had a huge advantage. Since he fused with the will of the great world, he had become an indestructible presence. Only if the great world was completely destroyed would Zen fall to death. At this moment, within several forests of the great world, the trees withered at a rate the eye could follow. The Nether Spring Cicada's attack was similar to that of Eddie's life and death wind back then, but the insect's attack was undoubtedly much stronger. Wherever the life and death wind went, the people within range would lose their lives. But its power to eliminate life energy was rather limited. This was why Letitia had managed to escape death before. This time, Zen had sacrificed tens of thousands of acres of forest in the central region before finally stopping the transfer of power. Come on. Suddenly, Zen raised his sword. The frozen battle came back to life, but the auras of the 8 godly geniuses were now completely different. Then, Zen took the lead as lightning bolts shot out from the Thunderwind divine sword and madly rushed towards the Grand Sorcerer. Rocher seemed like a ray of light. Every time he flashed, the sword radiance would shoot out at the same time. Lone, Lucille, and the rest didn't give the Grand Sorcerer a chance to catch his breath. Their momentum was growing more and more intimidating. On the other side, the Grand Sorcerer was steadily losing ground as he faced the warrior's sharp attacks. Nathan held tightly onto his spear as he glanced at Zen attacking from the very front of the group. In his heart, Nathan came to a realization. Even though he had lost to Zen, he couldn't accept it. In his mind, Zen's existence was an omission from the heavens. He attributed his defeat to his bad luck. Or perhaps, he had lost to Zen because of the Patriarch's interference. This defeat was like a thorn in his heart that he couldn't get rid of. His suffering was constant. Only now did Nathan realize that there was something special about Zen that he himself just did not possess. Nathan didn't know how Zen managed to survive the Grand Sorcerer's attack, but if he were in Zen's shoes, he definitely wouldn't have gotten in the way and taken on the attack for someone else. He was a godly genius, meaning his existence was important. If someone had to die, it wouldn't be him. Such was what he and the elders of the Xuanyuan clan always believed. It was a selfish thought, but it was justified. Still, a justified thought wasn't necessarily always the best. "I owe you this time," Nathan muttered to himself before lifting his spear and following behind Zen to join the attack. That night, the skies above the central region rumbled continuously. From time to time, lightning would erupt before flames filled the sky, burning brightly and illuminating half the sky. As they continued fighting, the situation began to turn one-sided. After Zen transferred all the power that was meant to weaken him, he showed no fear toward the Grand Sorcerer's tricks at all. Instead, he continued following the Grand Sorcerer like a shadow as he made his attacks. The other godly geniuses' attacks weren't to be ignored either. Although the Grand Sorcerer had the cultivation of a world lord, he wasn't indestructible. And Nathan's lost spear strike was a deadly threat. Under the full attack of the 8 godly geniuses, the Grand Sorcerer's body was soon covered with wounds gushing green blood. It was an unprecedented result. A dignified world lord was pushed into such a miserable state by a group of kids at the Spirit Supreme realm. These 8 young warriors were originally the Grand Sorcerer's targets, but their positions had reversed. The godly geniuses were now chasing after the Grand Sorcerer. Even more troublesome was the smoky heart-locking curse. While the sorcerer race's spells were extremely powerful, they also had negative effects. For example, after the death of the sorcerer slaves and the war sorcerers, they would produce strong curses. And the small skulls from the curses were almost impossible to damage. An ordinary martial artist had no solution to get rid of them. But the fact that these skulls came at the cost of numerous lives couldn't be ignored. The law of conservation never failed. To reach the highest level of the emotion-closing godly way, one had to completely abandon their emotions and sacrifice their 6 desires. This was why the emotion-closing godly way was so powerful. The same logic applied to a sorcerer's spells. After the smoky heart-locking curse was cast, the Grand Sorcerer's own heart was then locked with the hearts of the 8 godly geniuses. He couldn't remove the curse himself. In such a miserable state, the Grand Sorcerer finally made a decision. He tore open a space crack and snuck into the backside of the Great World. But Zen and the others were intent on killing. How could they just let the guy go? They chased after him through the space crack. When they entered the backside of the Great World, they were left shocked at the scene before them. It was as if someone had cast a strong spell on the Grand Sorcerer. He stood there, unmoving. On the other side of the Great World, Zen finally saw the complete body of the tail. The length of this torch dragon exceeded Zen's imagination. Its slender body looked like that of a snake, and on it rested the head of a dragon. Atop the dragon head, a raging fire was burning. The torch dragon was also called the candle dragon. Legend had it that the flame atop the candle dragon's head was as chaotic as a candle flame. At this moment, the torch dragon fiercely battled Supreme Lord Mirage. When Zen and the others stepped into the space crack, they had unwittingly barged into the center of another battle. Chapter 1450, Fighting the Torch Dragon. The torch dragon, like a great river stretching for thousands of miles, twisted its body in circles in the vastness. Hot smoke spilled from its enormous nostrils, clearly angered. The atmosphere was tense, on edge. Everyone knew this was a fierce battle. The creature's body could be compared to that of a genuine dragon, for in many ways, they were very similar. The 2 kinds of dragons could be distinguished by their heads though, which were completely different. That of the torch dragon was like a bird's beak, long and pointy with a curved shape. Sharp, too. 2 gill-like flaps of very thin skin grew on both sides of its neck, giving it the menacing look you'd expect from a cobra. Staring at a flame ablaze on its head, the torch dragon continued its process of capturing Supreme Lord Mirage by circling him dizzyingly. Moving at a quick pace, the Supreme Lord and the torch dragon headed toward depths of the backside of the world. No one could really see what was happening when the two were moving so fast. The backside of its unimaginably huge body continuously appeared before the bystanders' eyes as they watched at a far distance. The patterns on its scales were extremely exquisite and special, tinkling when they crossed paths with the flame from above, but no one was in the mood to appreciate such beauty. If one was to consider the torch dragon to be a powerhouse just like a Supreme Lord, then this could be regarded as a confrontation between two Supreme Lords. Not a single word was spoken aloud, and yet the entire crowd clearly understood that if the dragon were to change directions and wrap them tightly with its body, they would all die a painful death of suffocation. Closer to the action between Supreme Lord Mirage and the dragon, both Zen and Rocher had the urgent desire to leave the backside of the world. The battle here wasn't something they could allow themselves to get involved in. They were strong, that was undeniable, but not strong enough to face something so great. The Supreme Lord's strength was more apparent to Nathan, Lucille and the others as ever. With their current cultivation, if they were involved in the battle, they would be turned into ashes in a matter of seconds. Too late. A few glances at each other were enough for their hearts to begin pounding in terror. A wisp of black smoke had appeared on each of their chests. In a moment of absolute despair, they realized that the smoky heart-locking curse had tied the Grand Sorcerer and all 8 of them together. Kill the Grand Sorcerer first, and then leave this place, Nathan demanded through gritted teeth. Every single muscle in his body was now tense, his eyes red and bulging. He was making a forceful effort, to say the least, and every swollen vein in his arms could be counted off one by one. The long spear in his hand began spinning, slowly at first and then picking up speed, like a wheel. Nathan stared straight at the Grand Sorcerer in front of him, spatters of blood appearing in the white of his eyes. Without a blink, he held his gaze and one after the other, the blood vessels in his eyes began to burst. Blood was suddenly flowing from his eyes, creating skinny red rivers down the length of his cheeks and dripping off his jawline. He looked really bad and the devil, truly terrifying. Unexpectedly, the otherworldly swordsman's broken sword suddenly rose into the air at the same time. Its consciousness seemed to have been pushed to its limit. A series of circular sword patterns spread out, trapping the Grand Sorcerer within them. Purple River Sword Array. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The battle had begun without warning. The remainder of the crowd backed up even further. Desperate times required desperate measures and Margaret hadn't hesitated in setting up her own sword array. Lucille, Rocher and Kurt equally played their ace cards, one after another. Swords clanged, sparks flew and spell chants could be heard from all 3 of them. Bursts of light and smoke came from their weapons and attacked the Grand Sorcerer with everything they had. They all shared one and only thought, to kill the Grand Sorcerer in the shortest amount of time and then flee. As their minds focused and conjoined on this thought, they thrashed their weapons with confidence. As everyone began attacking with the precision of skills and the will to live, the Grand Sorcerer began to take action, now fighting for himself. The thorns covering the greater part of his body stood up fiercely, and his originally twisted body began to take an even stranger shape. From behind him, a scorpion's shadow appeared. Holy Poison Body. The Holy Poison Body was one of the unique skills only possessed by the elders of the sorcerer race. If they decided to transform their blood into the most deadly poisons, they had to give up their lives. The Holy Poison Body was of strong toxicity. After it was activated, they would die from the poison. There was no cure. There were many cultivation techniques in the sorcerer race that had powerful side effects. This technique held the ultimate consequence though, death. Sure, they could defeat their enemies by using the Holy Poison Body, but they'd be paying through the nose for doing so. Thus, such a technique was only used on the rarest occasions. This battle was of utmost importance. It would only take 2 hours following the activation of the Holy Poison Body that the Grand Sorcerer would resemble the reincarnation of a poison god. His body, power and perception would all be strengthened quickly and greatly. 2 hours later, however, he himself would die from the poison. Deep in his heart, the Grand Sorcerer didn't want to use the Holy Poison Body, but killing the 8 godly geniuses was now the only thing on his mind, the message pumping from his heart, to his brain, and traveling throughout his entire body, all the way down to his fingertips. For the sake of his race, he would rather give up his own life. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The poisonous, dark green smoke began rising into the air. The Grand Sorcerer didn't budge in the least. No one even noticed a flinch. Instead, He rushed toward his opponents, letting the young warriors launch their deadly attacks on him in consecutive lances. He kept his focus. He knew the only thing he truly had to avoid at all costs was Nathan's spear. Nathan's spear skills were too terrific and too terrifying. Every thrust was a fatal threat. Even though the Grand Sorcerer's strength had been greatly improved by the holy poison body, he still couldn't forcefully take Nathan's spear strikes. He dodged his opponent's all attacks while keeping as far as possible from Nathan's deadly spear. Suddenly, the mist began to spin and pick up speed, somewhat like a tornado except the fact that the Grand Sorcerer was standing right in the middle of it. In less than a few seconds, he was completely wrapped from head to toe by the deadly, whirling mist. The 8 godly geniuses began to retreat in turn, their faces brimming with worry, sweat streaking down their dirty faces. The torch dragon's huge body with single scale the size of a human head would occasionally pass by them. As long as they were caught inside its body, there would be no reason for them to live anyway. They had been dragged to the brink of death, and if they wasted just a few more seconds, they would probably go straight over the edge. Despite the attempt with all their might and will, the Grand Sorcerer wasn't harmed at all. It was as though he was invincible, even though everyone knew the contrary to be true. Their attacks weren't strong enough, weren't hitting far enough. While everyone else was retreating, someone suddenly charged forward, leaving a puff of dirt and dust behind him as his feet quickly collided with the ground. "Zen, are you crazy?" Lucille shouted. Before anyone could react, Zen had already rushed over to the Grand Sorcerer and had even broken quite a number of his barbs. He too was now submerged in the poisonous mist. The crowd watched, both stunned and amazed, as Zen was fearlessly engulfed by the green poison. When he was only a few feet away from the Grand Sorcerer, Zen dropped to the ground, somersaulted and grabbed the Grand Sorcerer's arm. Using the arm for propulsion, Zen flipped himself into the air and landed behind the Grand Sorcerer. He flung both his arms beneath the Grand Sorcerer's armpits and bound his chest tightly. "Launch a joint attack on him. Quick!" Zen roared. Zen's mind went blank, completely empty. He couldn't utter another sentence or think another clear thought. All he knew was that they had to kill the Grand Sorcerer, or none of them would survive. Nathan clenched his jaw and twisted his body, both hands grasping his spear. The Grand Sorcerer who had activated the holy poison body was growing in power, and he was now stronger than ever before. Given his current state, he would probably be capable of fighting against the Grand World Lords. What was more, there were even fewer flaws in his body. And with Nathan's cultivation, it was already extremely difficult for him to spot a Grand World Lord's flaw. Zen, on the other hand, had managed to control the Grand Sorcerer despite the poisonous mist surrounding them both. How could he possibly have any reason to hesitate? The bloody light in his eyes flickered fiercely. He had already heavily overused his eyes' power. Now, as he reactivated them once again, his pupils burst. He suddenly became completely blind, and 2 streams of golden blood gushed out from his sockets. But just before his vision was taken from him forever, he finally saw the flaw in the holy poison body. And that would be the last image he would physically see in a short time. Go to perdition! His long spear flew into the air and began to vibrate, creating a spiral formation. With no time to react or counterattack, the lost spear strike began moving toward the Grand Sorcerer at high speed. Puff! The spear attack landed no less than 2 inches below the Grand Sorcerer's chest. This was his Achilles heel. His weak spot, his most vulnerable part. Nathan rolled backwards, mostly out of conditioned reflex, and was grabbed by Lawson. Although he couldn't see anything, he very well knew that he should stand far away from the Grand Sorcerer. Crack, 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 the Grand Sorcerer's face was filled with disbelief. Having activated the holy poison body, he had the ability and the strength to fight back, even against a Grand World Lord. There wasn't enough time, and the Grand Sorcerer wasn't quick enough, despite his increased abilities. Before he could muster an attack, he was surrounded and killed by warriors of the Spirit Supreme realm. He turned his head with great difficulty to look at Zen behind him. If any living creatures touched the poisonous mist, they would die instantly. Even the powerhouses like World Lords wouldn't dare to get too close. How could it be that Zen had remained safe and sound? These 8 godly geniuses were truly terrifying. Each one was more so than the next. What other uncommon, secret talents were they hiding? That was the last thought that came to the Grand Sorcerer's mind. With that, his body began to disintegrate, slowly crumbling away and transforming into wisps of black smoke. A few moments later, the Grand Sorcerer had completely dissipated into thin air. Once the black smoke had lifted somewhat and vision had begun to return, Zen's figure slowly emerged from the darkness. The green, whirly poisonous mist still surrounded his body. From the looks of it though, and to everyone's disbelief, he was absolutely fine. A single thought flashed across the minds of Lawson and the others. Was the Grand Sorcerer's poisonous mist not as terrifying as they had all imagined? All this time, were they led to believe a lie? As soon as this thought appeared, they just quickly rejected it. The poisoning of the sorcerer race wasn't something they could underestimate or ever question. There was only one other possibility: Zen could be completely immune to the poison. No one had proven to be immune to such a great technique in the past. The poisonous mist was still attached to Zen's body, trailing in wisps behind him, and thus no one dared approach him. Right now, the most important thing was to leave this place. Let's go. Without any hesitation, Rocher immediately created a space crack in the space with his sword, preparing their departure from the backside of the world. The crowd took a step back as the hairline crack began to pull apart, opening up into a full-blown tear. Blackness filled the crack, and despite the void, it was almost welcoming to see. As soon as one of the warriors stepped forward toward the space crack, the torch dragon's immense tail swung in their direction. People spread out in all directions in order to avoid getting smacked by the thick, scaly tail. The torch dragon was a vicious beast that was as powerful as a supreme lord in strength, but its body was several times larger. The energy contained within its tail alone might just be great enough to destroy an entire continent in a single motion. Fear filled the space once again. Unguarded from the attack, there was no way for anyone to properly avoid the dragon's tail whatsoever. The torch dragon was fighting with Supreme Lord Mirage. With a far leap, he faced the dragon head-on, weapon raised far above his head. Although Supreme Lord Mirage's methods were powerful, the torch dragon was equally remarkable. The most troublesome part was that Supreme Lord Mirage excelled in the time law, and the heavenly destiny he inherited was a law of causality of the time law. With that, he could bring time to a relatively still state. Nothing could completely stop time, not even the most powerful laws of the heavens. However, under the control of Supreme Lord Mirage, it could become infinitely slow, which would usually give him a great advantage, of course. Nevertheless, this method had a huge drawback. It was only effective on the life forms in the heavens. Because the torch dragon was not a being under the heavens to begin with, Supreme Lord Mirage's most powerful technique had lost all its effect on it. His master technique was rendered completely useless by this outrageous beast. He could only rely on his own abilities in order to continue fighting with the torch dragon. He knew that once Supreme Lord Sky killed the Supreme Sorcerer, they too might be able to kill the torch dragon together. It was only a question of time. But as he saw the 8 godly geniuses appear at the backside of the world and the torch dragon's tail sweep towards them, the Supreme Lord's expression abruptly changed. Chapter 1451, Transfer. Supreme Lord Mirage and Supreme Lord Sky both traveled to the lower world in order to protect the 8 godly geniuses. However, they did not expect to encounter the torch dragon and the Supreme Sorcerer. Something felt amiss, and the 2 Supreme Lords suspected that there was something extraordinary that was hidden within the great world for these 2 to suddenly appear. This was no doubt conspired by the sorcerer race. They immediately sent a request for reinforcements to the head of the Celestial Position race. Fortunately, their request was promptly received and the Celestial Position race mobilized right away. However, even if they reached their top speed, they still wouldn't be able to arrive on time. It didn't help that the entire universe was plunged in a state of chaos, with the Supreme Lords of the Thoughtless Minds and Humanity Alliance too busy protecting their own territories. Supreme Lord Mirage was still engaged in battle with the torch dragon. He could have killed the beast more quickly, but the safety of the godly geniuses was his utmost priority. He did not expect that the godly geniuses would go to the backside of the world. The torch dragon waved its tail towards the godly geniuses. Supreme Lord Mirage's heart jumped to his throat. The beast's tail was powerful enough to crush the godly geniuses. If that happened, not even Lester would be able to revive them. Unfortunately, he was suppressed by the torch dragon's strange fire, which made it difficult for him to rush in and rescue them. The sight of the torch dragon's enormous tail made everyone's faces turn pale. An opponent of this level was much more powerful than the Grand Sorcerer. 8 godly geniuses working together could probably defeat a world lord, but it might not be enough for them to resist a supreme lord. Everyone's heart sank at their helplessness. However, just in the nick of time, Zen stood at the front. He had advanced through the void and threw a punch just as the torch dragon's tail reached him. The punch had not been fortified with the power of the dragon scales. Zen figured it might have been pointless anyway. The torch dragon's body was enormous and the boost from the dragon scales might not even be enough for his punch to have any effect at all. All he really intended was to block the attack. Zen could only rely on this great world at that very moment. He had actually been hesitant at first. Blocking the Torch Dragon's attack had the possibility of also causing irreversible damage to the Great World. He knew this based on experience. Back when he blocked the black light, he sacrificed more than 5 million mountains. All tall landforms were leveled and there was nothing but plains in the Great World now. Tens of thousands of acres of forest were sacrificed. Every energy transfer brought catastrophic damage to the Great World since Zen transferred all the damage he endured. This time was different. Zen chose to bear the brunt of the Torch Dragon's attack. Any more damage rerouted to the Great World could destroy it entirely. However, Zen had no other choice. The 10 godly geniuses were the universe's last hope according to Master Feng. If Zen did not fight back, then all the godly geniuses would perish along with the hope for this universe's survival. The godly geniuses all stood in silence. Previously, they had assumed that the difference in power among the top 10 warriors wouldn't be too great. All of them were great warriors and were the main characters of this world of chaos. Zen might hold a more important role, but each of them remained indispensable. However, his actions just now proved that Zen's strength went way beyond anything they had ever expected. There had been no need to display these abilities in the illusion battlefield then, and seeing it now shed new light on Zen's power. A sliver of hope shone through their doubts and helplessness as they watched Zen fearlessly charge towards the Torch Dragon. Perhaps he had the ability to block the attack. However, they immediately dashed their high hopes. It was too much to put all their faith in just one man. Zen might have been born with strong strength, but that was not enough to make him more powerful than a Supreme Lord or a fierce Torch Dragon. Even 10 Supreme Lords would find it difficult to suppress a Torch Dragon, what more Zen? Swoosh! The Torch Dragon's tail approached the 8 godly geniuses like an extremely powerful whip. It felt like the sky itself was pressing down upon them. When trouble came, the strongest man was the one who dealt with it. Aside from Zen, nobody else tried to resist the attack. The moment Zen's fist and the Torch Dragon's tail collided, there was almost no sound at all. It was as if a whip hit an insignificant ant because of the huge size difference between the two. However, just as they thought they were about to witness Zen's end, a miracle happened. The moment the tail hit Zen, it abruptly stopped. He had used his own body to block the Torch Dragon's tail and stopped its attack. Crack! He was as big as a scale on the dragon's tail, but, during their collision, he was able to shatter these scales. Zen's back was pressed against the Great World, like a nail attached to a wall. The moment the Torch Dragon's tail swept over, its power was taken away by Zen, and the impact from their collision even injured the beast. Supreme Lord Mirage was in a state of panic. The sorcerer race had something sinister up their sleeves, while the celestial position was also plotting something. Supreme Lord Mirage found it absurd that even after all efforts of cultivating the 8 godly geniuses, the celestial position still failed. He felt an overwhelming sense of despair. The scene in front of him gave him tremendous visual impact, which was saying a lot since he was a Supreme Lord who had already lived for 130 million years. Right now, Zen looked like a mantis that blocked an entire car with its frail forelimbs. The sight stunned everyone into silence. Rocher, Kurt, Nathan, Lawson, all of them were extremely dumbfounded. Even though Rocher felt that he understood Zen best out of all of them, he couldn't deny that the young man still had a few secrets that they had yet to uncover and understand. Meanwhile, Zen himself was also a bit dumbfounded by everything. He could not figure out just how he stopped the Torch Dragon. It seemed that even he did not fully understand his own strength. Back when Zen blocked the Grand Sorcerer's staff, Rocher had already speculated that his friend might have possessed a secret treasure that enabled him to resist such attacks. It was also possible that it was because Zen's life energy was extremely strong that even the Nether Spring Cicada could not completely absorb it. The second time Zen attacked and bound that Grand Sorcerer, he also showed them his immunity to all poisons. It was impressive, but they could still think of a multitude of reasons for this. However, what they were seeing right now was simply incomprehensible. It was something that they might never have an explanation for. Lawson rubbed his eyes, but even after rubbing for a long time, the scene remained the same. What happened? Blood flowed from Nathan's face. He was unable to perceive the massive outline of the Torch Dragon with just his perception alone. All he could feel was the faint sense of power that swept over them. Zen has blocked the tail of that monster, Lucille whispered. Are you kidding? Nathan murmured back in disbelief. However, it was unlikely for Lucille to lie in this situation. If they hadn't seen this personally, perhaps nobody would ever believe that this event actually happened. Oh! The Torch Dragon suddenly let out a long and piercing cry. It wasn't a big deal if one scale fell or shattered on its body. What was a big deal was the fact that an ant managed to shatter it in the first place. It twisted its enormous body and prepared to strike down with its tail once again. Supreme Lord Mirage was ready this time. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He would voluntarily give his life away if that meant ensuring the safety of these godly geniuses. The death of a Supreme Lord meant a new crown of destiny and a new Supreme Lord. But nobody could ever replace a godly genius. There was nothing for creating a true god after all. Supreme Lord Mirage battled with the Torch Dragon head-on. As he did so, the great world underwent a violent change. Zen had almost completely shifted away the Torch Dragon's power and allowed the great world to absorb it. A battle between Supreme Lords usually entailed the destruction of a Supreme World, let alone a great world. This time, however, Zen did his best to transfer the power evenly. Most of it was routed to the northern savage land. During this process, Zen discovered something unexpected located in that place through the great world's will. Chapter 1452, Space Imprisonment. There were very few signs of life on the savage land. For countless years, nothing had changed. Lush vegetation covered the vast land, and countless vicious beasts and unknown creatures were hidden in the nooks and crannies of this wild land. Even the smallest ants present here were capable of inflicting danger. The areas through which the army ants marched were completely barren, and even the most ferocious beasts would steer clear of them. These fist-sized ants were capable of reducing an elephant into a skeleton in a blink of an eye. In the past, there had been powerhouses from the Divine Kingdom continent entering the savage land, and almost all of them had perished. Finally, the Divine Kingdom continent had given up on exploring this desolate land. All these years, only Rocher had stepped foot deep into the savage land. He had done this in the pursuit of taking away Chiyu's treasure. At this moment, the entire savage land began to tremble. A huge fissure extended from one end of the savage land to the other, forming a deep, bottomless gorge. Countless vicious beasts let out wails of grief. Rumble. The tremendous force which was like an invisible pair of scissors began to cut across the savage land. This savage land that was twice as large as the Divine Kingdom continent was constantly collapsing. The monstrous seawater formed a 10,000-foot-high water wall, pouring into the huge fissure. It crazily washed over the exposed surface of the ground, and myriad of creatures started to create a helter-skelter, running all over the land. As the seawater poured towards the deep fissure in the land, a massive siphonic effect was formed. In the end, it flowed towards the opposite direction of the fissure, rushing towards the Divine Kingdom continent. Fortunately, the cities of the 4 Divine Kingdoms were all gathered around the Feather Holy Sea. There was no one around the continental margin, so the tsunami didn't cause too much of a disaster to the Divine Kingdom continent. However, the fluctuations of the sea and that commotion that accompanied it aroused the vigilance of the 4 Divine Kingdoms. The blow from the Torch Dragon had been dodged by Zen and had caused the savage land to crumble. "Let's go," Zen said, unable to explain anything to the others here. If that Torch Dragon's tail swept over him again, he had no idea how he would defend himself against it. Would I have to sacrifice the Central region and the Divine Kingdom continent? This was a thought that ate him alive. In a heartbeat, Zen tore open a space crack and drilled out. The other godly geniuses also opened the space cracks and returned to the front of this world. Under the dim moonlight, the faces of those godly geniuses could be seen, full of dread. After all, just a moment ago, they had all thought that they were going to die. These godly geniuses looked at Zen again, but this time their expressions had softened. After all, he had valiantly blocked the attack from the Torch Dragon. Even if they racked their brains, it would be hard for them to figure out how Zen had done it. There were countless secret treasures in the universe, all of which had their own uses. But even if it was one of the top 10 treasures on the Universe Spirit Tablet, it would still be impossible to display such an effect. "What should we do now?" Lucille asked. "If that Torch Dragon chases us, we'll be in big trouble," Lone said as he turned to look at Zen. No matter what, this place was already extremely dangerous for the 8 of them. It wasn't advisable for them to stay there any longer. The wisest choice was to leave right at this moment. All right, you can leave first. But I will not leave," Zen replied firmly. Once he was done, he activated the teleportation token. Kurt and the others nodded. They realized it wasn't required for them to take any risk, seeing what was happening right before their eyes. Leaving at this moment was definitely the most sensible choice. However, the moment Zen activated the teleportation token, the tiny power of space failed to gather. The incandescent light turned into strange fragments that scattered in all directions like pieces of broken glass. "What's going on?" Rocher frowned slightly. "Perhaps it isn't possible to gather all the power of space together," Zen remarked, looking utterly confused. He had never come across a similar problem before. Once Zen finished speaking, his figure flashed as he attempted to use a spatial traveling. However, just as his figure disappeared, he seemed to crash into an invisible wall, causing him to stumble in the air. Space imprisonment, Lucille exclaimed as she witnessed the scene in front of her. Lawson's expression changed too. Looking up, he said, "Someone is imprisoning this space." Who could it be? Nathan wondered with his eyes closed. By now, he had already wiped the golden blood from his face. Since he was already blind, he was even more anxious to leave this place. So after hearing about the space imprisonment, his anxieties naturally notched up. Imprisoning the great world can only be managed by a Supreme Lord. Perhaps someone has imprisoned this area, let's try somewhere else. Zen genuinely wanted to figure out a way to send them out. The group continued downwards. After traveling for a long distance, Zen activated his teleportation token again. However, the result was the same as before. It was as if all the space law here had lost its effect. "It seems we will all end up dying here," Nathan exclaimed while his face revealed a bitter smile. In contrast, Rocher was a bit more open-minded. He smiled and asked Zen, "How did you block that attack from the torch dragon just a while ago?" Zen's eyes flickered as he chuckled. "I am sorry, but I can't answer that question now," he added, continuing to smile. Actually, there was no need for Zen to hide this. Fusing with the will of the great world was Zen's secret, and he had no reason for keeping it a secret. However, Rocher was someone who knew a lot yet kept things from Zen. He grinned because he was happy to finally retaliate. Listening to Zen's evasive reply, Rocher sniffed and looked at the thick clouds in the sky. He did not push Zen anymore for an explanation, instead he only said, "It looks like something big is bound to happen in the great world, but I have a feeling that something is amiss. It seems that the sorcerer race has a trap set up here." "A trap? Against us?" Lone asked. Rocher shook his head and replied, "No, it might be a trap meant for the Supreme Lords." It was not hard to guess that, for the 8 godly geniuses had met with danger, and the 2 Supreme Lords that were protecting them had fallen into a life-and-death battle. Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, and the others would definitely not be able to sit still, and they would definitely arrive as soon as possible. At the speed with which the Supreme Lords performed, even if the lower world was far from the upper world, they would still be able to arrive in a short period of time. And once help arrived, they firmly believed that the Torch Dragon and the Supreme Sorcerer would end up dead. There weren't that many Supreme Sorcerers in the Sorcerer race. It was very likely that there were no more than 10 of them. At the current stage, it wouldn't be smart for the Sorcerer race to fight foolishly with Supreme Lord of Original Sin and the others. The Torch Dragon did not leave and had chosen to fight with Supreme Lord Mirage. This in itself was an indication that the Sorcerer race was not afraid of any backup from the universe. "The Sorcerer race is no match for us, and they don't fear the backup," Lucille said with her elegant brows furrowed. She continued, "Then, the only possibility is that this place is a trap." "Lucille has already figured it out," Rocher added and smiled faintly. "What's the use of figuring it out?" Lawson's cold voice retorted. "We can't leave this place. I do have 2 roaring tokens, but even if we use them, we won't be able to transmit our voices out here," he said, reeking with disappointment. Zen drifted down a distance before he turned around and said, "You're right. We can't leave here. Let's head back to the Cloud Hall now." On the way, Zen's eyebrows twisted tightly. In order to save Letitia, he had returned to the lower world. This matter could not have been planned by the Sorcerer race. However, the Sorcerer race cared a great deal about Letitia and Preston returning to the lower world, which was why they chased after them. Zen was still confused about the turn of events. But just as Rocher speculated, he too believed this great world was indeed a trap. However, the Sorcerer race did not plan to activate this trap right now. It wasn't meant for them, hence it had to be a coincidence they had entered it. Something told Zed this trap had something to do with the chaotic ocean of stars and the star storm. However, even Zen was unable to completely connect the dots. He couldn't find an appropriate answer to what the trap was. With his current strength, there was no way for him to interfere in a fight between powerhouses at the level of the Supreme Lords. Under the circumstance, the only thing Zed could do was return to the Cloud Hall. On the way back to the Cloud Hall, Zen took out his token of mountain and tried to contact the Fairy Palace. This Fairy Palace was Zen's last shelter. If he couldn't enter the Fairy Palace, then he was destined to be doomed. Soon, Zen's expression turned even severer. The fact that Zen could return to the Fairy Palace quickly by token of the mountain didn't mean that he had the Fairy Palace with him. From beginning to end, the Fairy Palace had always been located in that huge forest, and this token had only created a special pathway. In the end, he realized even the token of mountain used the space law, which meant Zen couldn't return to the fairy palace either. I am actually doomed, he thought with a frustrated sigh. Chapter 1453, Waiting. Zen had a plan. As the universe was in turmoil, he would gather all of the important people around him into the fairy palace when he returned to the lower world. While they remained under the protection of the fairy palace, they would be absolutely safe. However, because of the space imprisonment, this plan could not work. The 7 people filed silently behind Zen. Despite their silence, he could sense their nervousness. Although they were powerful, they were still too young and inexperienced for what laid ahead of them. The growing tension among the group caused their hearts to pound until they were clanging like 15 buckets in a single well as they trudged along. The depressing atmosphere weighed heavily on Zen's mind. Rocher had told him that the idea of destiny was only a beautiful lie, but he wouldn't let that stop him. Since they had made it this far, he had to ensure that they made it through to the end. By this time the outline of the cloud hall was faintly discernible in the clouds. When Zen approached, he found that the hall was now empty and almost all the warriors had left. Considering the ferocity of Supreme Lords' fights, this sort of retreat was meaningless. If the Torch Dragon and Supreme Lord Mirage had wanted to fight in the central region, in only a few moves, the entire central region would have collapsed. In the face of such absolute strength, weak warriors were unable to resist. They were like fish on a chopping block. Given Zen's current cultivation level, the warriors of the central region were unable to catch up with him. However, it did not change anything. It did not take long for Zen to find Letitia in the ice palace at the top of the cloud hall. She sat cross-legged in the middle of the palace, focusing on her cultivation. The life vitality in the lower world was far too thin. The cultivation speed of warriors at the Soul Sea realm was far below those in the upper world. Zen descended along the ice palace's patio with the other 7 godly geniuses following closely behind him. Startled by the commotion, Letitia opened her eyes and glanced around her. Her face was etched with the signs of a sleepless night. She had been busy all night, but her exhaustion was mental rather than physical. She found herself continually tense. There were so many things that scared her. She was worried that Zen would not return, that the powerful warriors would destroy the central region, and that something bad would happen to her son Jeffrey. When her eyes saw Zen, a smile spread across her tired features. "Where's Jeffrey?" Zen asked softly. "My master has taken him to the east. He should be safe there," Letitia replied. Hearing this, the 7 godly geniuses thought within themselves. Safe? There wasn't anywhere in this great world that was safe. No matter where they hid, unless they were careful, they could still be affected by the Supreme Lords. Silently Zen agreed with them. He had personally used his power transfer to destroy a piece of the savage land. He knew that hiding was useless. However, he wasn't planning to let the disciples of the Cloud Hall return. It was just what people thought. Even if they knew that there was no escape, they would still stubbornly look for a safe place to hide away. Zen did not make a specific suggestion for the next step. His followers waited quietly in the ice palace, meditating. Margaret didn't meditate. She fell asleep while leaning against Zen. Letitia threw her eye on Margaret, wondering how she could fall asleep at a time like this. Lone and Lucille refused to give up. After an intense discussion, they each proposed a solution to their predicament. Lucille was considering eliminating the effects of the moon-shrouding stone and using the repelling force of the Great World to force them out. Quickly, she took action. Once she released the moon-shrouding stone, the repelling force of the Great World bore down on her body. The irresistible force would bring her all the way into the ascending passageway. This gave the other godly geniuses a ray of hope. Perhaps they could use the ascending passageway to break free from their space imprisonment. However, things did not go as they had hoped. Lucille lightly flew off into the sky but soon stopped in midair. The ascending passageway failed to appear. With a sigh, they realized that they should not have been surprised. The ascending passageway was a manifestation of the space law, and now that the space had been locked, it was naturally impossible for the passageway to appear. Lone's solution was even more direct. Since they were trapped in this great world, unable to use the space law, then they should be able to directly pierce through the gale stratum. Although the gale at the top of the world was immensely powerful, they still had a way to resist it. They considered that there was a high chance that this plan could succeed. After Lone had suggested it, Lawson immediately agreed. Then, the two of them, along with Kurt, set off from the top floor of the Cloud Hall and headed upwards. 4 hours later, the 3 of them returned to the Cloud Hall in low spirits. Just by looking at their expressions, Zen knew that they had failed. "We encountered an impenetrable space after passing the gale stratum. We tried everything we could think of, but we still couldn't pass through it, Lawson said gloomily. Zen uttered a few words of consolation. They had no choice now but to wait. Unknown by them, the night had passed and the sky was quickly lightening. Rocher quietly stood up and unsheathed his soaring snake sword. With a light wave of his sharp sword tip, a small crack appeared in the air. The other side of the space was normally dark. Even when a crack was opened, it should have been hard to see anything. However, now the situation was different. The Torch Dragon was fighting with Supreme Lord Mirage and Rocher wanted to take a closer look. When Lucille saw his movement, she asked nervously, "What's the situation like?" Rocher shook his head. "I can't see anything." There were no obstructions at the back of the space, so the Torch Dragon and Supreme Lord Mirage had gone far away. Everyone was relieved by his reply. At the very least, they were already a long way from the central region, even if the distance was only a single step for the Supreme Lords. At that moment, Zen sensed a powerful aura descending. The other godly geniuses had the same feeling, including Letitia. Moreover, all of the life forms in the central region had also felt it, so they subconsciously looked towards the sky. As that majestic aura seemed to fill the sky, the hearts of hundreds of millions of lives below throbbed in expectation. The clouds at the top of the cloud hall continued to surge and rapidly dissipated to their surroundings like a huge, reverse vortex. In the blink of an eye, 7 figures descended to the ground. The godly geniuses raised their heads to take in the 7 figures as they approached. Patriarch. Nathan was blind, but that did not stop him sensing the aura of Supreme Lord of Original Sin. Since yesterday, he had been in a state of panic, but now as he felt the aura of the patriarch of his clan, he found himself able to relax. As far as he was concerned, Supreme Lord of Original Sin was the strongest warrior in the universe. Since he was here, his safety was no longer in doubt. Nathan was not the only one reassured. Lucille, Kurt, and the others also let out a long sigh. It no longer mattered whether or not this great world was a trap. It would be much safer now as their elders had joined them. Supreme Lord of Original Sin was not alone. He had arrived with Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Oracle, Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment and others. To judge by outward appearance, all the troubles caused to the universe by the sorcerer race had been solved. However, the Supreme Lords all appeared grim, including Master Feng, who was always amiable. Obviously, the situation was more troublesome than they had thought. Supreme Lord of Original Sin swept his gaze over the godly geniuses. After confirming that they were all present, he said lightly, "Take them away." At once, Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment raised his sleeve, a bag immediately appeared and sucked in Nathan and the others one by one. When it was Zen's turn, he jumped to one side and said sullenly, "I won't leave." Chapter 1454. Overpower this great world's will. The Supreme Lords were summoned here by Supreme Lord Mirage and Supreme Lord Sky. Upon arrival, the first thing they did was to protect the 8 godly geniuses. Now that things had calmed down a bit, they were very eager to leave. Zen, however, was determined to stay. Since the young man insisted, then they would not force him. They willingly left him there with Margaret before flying into the void. The space imprisonment must have been lifted since these Supreme Lords managed to come here. Zen was now left behind due to his decision to stay. He had a lot of things to address. No matter how the situation in the Great World developed, it was his utmost priority to relocate Letitia and the others to a safer place. With this in mind, he took both Letitia and Margaret with him and left Cloud Hall. They eventually met up with Imogen and Jeffrey 300 miles north of Cloudy City, and then also managed to run into Louis, Patrick, and a few others. Then Zen activated the token of mountain in front of everyone. He hadn't told them anything about the fairy palace since it was something whose secrets he could not easily reveal to others. Given their current situation, however, Zen figured that this place could serve as a temporary refuge for all of them. He didn't worry too much about them being there since the fairy palace itself imposed restrictions everywhere, and without his tokens they couldn't freely move around in the fairy palace. Zen, however, did not enter the fairy palace. Ever since his return to this great world, he felt something off. It was as if it had undergone some changes with its will, which was really strange. One end of the great world was broken. That meant that 2 great worlds were connected to each other without any hindrances between them. He also discovered that the barrier at the other end of this great world was gone as well. Zen tried to search through the memories of the great world's will for an explanation, but he found nothing. Right now, however, he was sure of 2 things. The barriers were definitely destroyed by someone, and the person who destroyed them was most definitely not from around here. This was highly possible to be the work of the sorcerer race. As for their intentions of doing so, Zen had no idea. This was his primary reason for staying. The turmoil in Cloud Hall plunged the entire central region into a panic. News of disaster always spread like wildfire. All of Cloud Hall's warriors had been dismissed and numerous people in Cloudy City spread out through various transmission channels. Central region was their home. If they left, where would they go? Not everyone could pass through the storm in the chaotic ocean of stars. Once Zen arranged for everyone's safety, he quickly went to the back of the Great World. On this side of the world was a void, completely shrouded in darkness. This was where Master Feng and the other Supreme Lords entered, but they had already flown far away. After confirming the direction that they had gone in, Zen decidedly flew into this void. Supreme Lords move thousands of miles in an instant during their battles, so Zen figured that it might be impossible for him to catch up to them. 10,000 miles away from Zen, the enormous torch dragon was coiled high up in the air. On its huge head was a wisp of dim, strange fire. Its eyes gazed with sinister intent at its opponents. Its body was currently covered in wounds. Given the state of the torch dragon, it could most probably only contend against a mid-rank Supreme Lord. Unfortunately, it was currently faced with a number of powerful opponents: Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment, and Supreme Lord of Oracle. They were all top-ranked Supreme Lords in the universe. There was no way that this sacred beast of the sorcerer race would be able to fight back. Supreme Lord Mirage had already flown away after sustaining major injuries during his fight with the Torch Dragon. Supreme Lord Sky, on the other hand, had already killed the Supreme Sorcerer and joined the attack against the sacred beast. All of the Supreme Lords were expressionless. They had all gathered here to do one thing: to eliminate the sorcerer race. This Torch Dragon was going to be extremely valuable to them once killed. Whether it be the eyes or the flame above its head, every single part of its body was going to be harvested as extremely precious material. The Supreme Lords were already thinking about how to divide the spoils amongst themselves. However, at that moment, countless war sorcerers prostrated themselves in front of a tower hidden deep within the core of the storm in the chaotic ocean of stars. The Grand Sorcerer that led the group held a bone cane from which rose another flame. There was a hum as everyone chanted a complicated spell. As they chanted, the war sorcerers began to disintegrate one by one. Their bodies and souls transformed into dark green flames as they vanished. These flames gathered together and strengthened the flame at the tip of the Grand Sorcerer's bone cane. The wisp had now transformed into a furious, burning flame. Swish! The nether flame rose high into the air, like a violent pillar of fire. The Grand Sorcerer carefully raised it up and put it near the tower. Sizzle! Dark green flames quickly sparked and spread all throughout the tower. Uyaka! It was the Grand Sorcerer who screamed the final chant before transforming into a nether flame himself to join the others. At that moment, the tower began to slowly rotate, gaining speed with each revolution. As it spun around, many tiny cracks began to appear on its surface. Crack, crack, crack. The tiny cracks continued to spread and expand as if there was something within the tower that wanted to escape. At the same time, the storm at the core of the chaotic ocean of stars also grew stronger and the space itself began to crack under the devastating slashes of the wind blades. Space cracks continued to appear all over the area wherein the wind blades seeped through. Boom! The tower exploded inevitably. An invisible will then began to spread rapidly. And this storm helped this will to spread faster. Several hundred great worlds away, a similar tower also exploded. This place was called the Wind God Forbidden Land, due to the stormland in this great world. Legend said that a wind god resided in the center of this storm. Even a Soul Sea Realm warrior had no chances of surviving this place's endless gust. As it exploded, an invisible will was also released. These weren't the only two towers to have done so. Other towers, all constructed by the sorcerer race, were exploding in succession all over the great worlds. These structures were erected with precise calculation and meticulous planning by the entire race. As these towers exploded, their wills began to spread through numerous great worlds. The barriers between different great worlds had been removed, which enabled the wills to spread even more effectively. Master Feng and the other Supreme Lords were still locked in a face-to-face battle with the huge Torch Dragon. Supreme Lord of Original Sin was the first to initiate an attack. He was not afraid despite the beast's powerful, physical body. Hiss! The massive Torch Dragon twisted in midair with a sharp cry. To everyone's great surprise, it chose to retreat. How could they let this precious beast leave so easily? All the Supreme Lords turned into beams of light that surrounded the Torch Dragon. However, the will from the tower at the core of the storm had already spread out by this time. The Supreme Lords all felt it in the air and they stopped in their tracks as if someone had cast a spell on them. Zen also felt it. A look of confusion fell on his face. What is that? This will was extremely domineering, as if it wanted to directly overpower this great world's will. Chapter 1455. The Invader. After Zen had fused with the great world's will, he had become the son of the great world. He actually became the master of the great world. This was the reason why he could transfer the power he had received into the great world. He could even look through the memories of any time and place if he wished. However, as the strange will spread out, it gradually integrated itself into the will of the great world. Zen wasn't able to do anything to prevent this from happening. Because his will was fused with the great world's, the three wills were now fused together. It also surprised Zen that this strange will had spread out at an extremely rapid pace. In just half a minute, the will had already extended beyond the great world. It engulfed the wills of some other great worlds and continued to expand rapidly. Zen was astonished. In the past, the great world was damaged and had an opening. Zen sensed that he could explore great worlds beyond it, such as the ocean of the nearest neighboring great world. At that moment, however, he knew and he felt that the range of his perception was rapidly increasing at an incredible rate. He perceived everything happening within the four surrounding great worlds. For instance, the southern great world only had one giant continent. This continent had a land area that was almost 20 times larger than the Divine Kingdom continent. The sea realm there was not too large, it was only about a third of the great world. The northern great world was the complete opposite. The entire great world was surrounded by water, with islands interspersed throughout the ocean. On these islands existed diverse kinds of creatures, but the majority were humans. After 2 minutes, Zen realized he could perceive 16 great worlds. After around 5 minutes, he already sensed more than 400 great worlds. It was at that point that the speed at which the will was frantically spreading out gradually slowed down. The will's limit of expansion is less than 500 great worlds. Zen continuously reached inside his consciousness as he came up with a rough estimate. He wasn't sure if he could transfer the power he received into these great worlds. If he was able to do so, it would be an enormous enhancement for his capabilities. He hoped that his will would expand further. At that moment, he discovered that the great worlds he perceived had doubled in number. He was able to sense over 1,000 great worlds. What's going on? Zen was slightly surprised. He thought for a moment and quickly understood what happened. This strange will had spread outwards from the center of the chaotic ocean of stars and had gradually extended across more than 500 great worlds. In fact, there appeared to be more of this kind of extremely special will that existed in other great worlds. They continued to expand and fuse with each other. Could it be that 1,000,000 great worlds could all be interconnected? If this was really the work of the sorcerer race, then they must have been plotting truly terrible things. Zen was completely shocked. By the time he reached that conclusion, the number of great worlds that he sensed had already doubled. 3,000 great worlds. These wills spread out from their original positions and began to fuse with each other across the great worlds. The number of great worlds that Zen perceived continued to increase, and the speed at which it increased also got faster and faster. 15,000 great worlds, 40,000, 100,000, 300,000, 800,000. As time passed, the speed at which the wills spread accelerated. But it ended at some point. Zen's mind had already sensed over 1,000,000 great worlds, 1,033 great worlds to be exact. It was a very strange feeling for him. All of the 1,033 great worlds were connected into one entity. Zen realized he could sense everything within this whole entity. There were countless life forms living in each of these great worlds. They lived, cultivated, competed with each other, and multiplied in their own worlds. There were many secrets, secret places, and treasures, just waiting for the martial artists to discover them, excavate them, and explore them. But as for Zen, all he needed was a thought and these secrets would be exposed to him. There was a great world, 100,000 great worlds away from the one Zen was located in, where a war between ogres and demon knight warriors erupted on a continent. Almost all the ogres were slaughtered by the demon knight warriors, only a few hundred of the surviving ogres launched a counterattack. In a nearby great world, a grand ceremony was being held. It seemed that it was the wedding of a certain Divine Kingdom emperor. Whether it was a sect war, a mortal, or even an insect, Zen was able to grasp anything he wanted to know. At that moment, Zen had a vision, as if he was the god of all great worlds. What overwhelmed Zen even more was that when this will reach the edge of the great worlds, it seemed to have a tendency to ascend upwards. It went through countless ascending passageways, spreading out into the universe. At the end of these passageways were 100,000 supreme worlds, as well as an infinite number of stars. Zen was dumbfounded. Could this will spread to the upper world? He wanted to determine if he could transfer the power he received into these great worlds. In order to see for himself, Zen flipped his hand and struck himself in the chest. In a great world that was tens of millions of miles away from Zen, a stone in the jungle of a certain continent suddenly burst in an explosion. Wow! Zen's eyes lit up, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile. In theory, Zen had fused with the wills of all of the great worlds. As long as he was standing in one of the great worlds, he would be undefeatable, unless his opponent had the power to destroy all the great worlds. However, if Zen was to fight a supreme lord, he would be at a disadvantage. After all, if the torch dragon was to use its tail to strike through a land area, it would be possible to destroy a land mass. If Zen transferred the attacks of a supreme lord to the great worlds, he knew that all the great worlds would most probably be destroyed. He continued to sense changes in the wills of the great worlds. At the same moment, when Master Feng and the others felt this change, their faces became gloomy. Is this the true plan of the sorcerer race? Supreme Lord of Original Sin's face was dark. They actually want to control the heavens. This is impossible, Supreme Lord of Oracle frowned. As they watched, the torch dragon in front of them underwent a drastic transformation. Its huge body constantly twisted and shrunk. It had chosen to take a human form at this moment. Its previously colossal body finally transformed into the appearance of a petite woman. However, this woman did not have hair anywhere on her body. Instead, a slow-burning flame was on top of her head. After taking form, the torch dragon was still covered in wounds. But she stared at the various supreme lords and smiled coldly. Sorry, guys, you've already lost. As soon as she finished speaking, a map-like rune slowly appeared on her forehead. The rune flickered like a firefly, which caused the torch dragon to enter a certain state. Zen, who was still enjoying his exploration of the great worlds, suddenly felt a strong will invade the will of the great world. Chapter 1456. Shut the strange consciousness out. Zen's soul had merged with the wills of all the great worlds. The wills of the great worlds did not possess their own intellect. They would only respond to the damage done to their respective great worlds by reacting instinctively. Zen's soul could already control all of the great worlds to some extent. The strange consciousness was exceedingly strong, and not something that Zen could contend with his current soul. However, he had the upper hand. He did not need to rely on his own soul to resist the consciousness. He could summon the wills of all the great worlds to resist it. No matter how powerful one's soul was, it was impossible for it to resist the will of a great world. Moreover, now there were wills of 1,033 great worlds. No creature in the universe would be able to deal with the shocking number of wills. Even a supreme lord who was skilled in cultivating the soul would fail to obstruct these wills. This strange consciousness seems to be using some sort of secret technique and wants to fuse with the wills of the great worlds. A curious expression appeared on Zen's face as he pondered over the situation. His soul had been unintentionally merged into the wills of the great worlds, but it seemed as if his enemy had done it on purpose. Zen smiled faintly. The wills of the great worlds followed his thought, and a trace of killing intent flickered. Swoosh! A formless killing intent began to spread out. All the living beings in the 1,033 great worlds looked up at the same time. The trace of killing intent was felt by all of them, including countless nature creatures, illuminating soul realm warriors and internal elixir realm warriors, lords of sacred places, emperors of divine kingdoms, vicious beasts hidden underground, mighty warriors perched atop mountains. This is the killing intent of the heavens. The heavens are furious. Just who is it that has caused the heavens to be enraged? Please don't be angry. This is a great opportunity. I might learn something from the heavens. Countless creatures were trying to uncover the meaning behind this killing intent. They didn't know that a germ of an idea in Zen's mind had sparked this vicious killing intent. Just how powerful was this killing intent? In just a split second, the powerful invading consciousness was extinguished by the wills of the great worlds. The powerful consciousness was like a candle flame in a torrential downpour, completely fragile and weak. As a result, it was put out instantly. The Supreme Lords also sensed the murderous intent at the same time. Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, Supreme Lord of Oracle and the others were also baffled. What was the source of this killing intent? They refused to believe that the great worlds would be so angry. The great worlds indeed had their wills, but the wills couldn't transform into various emotions and act upon them. The heavens were like a puppet that could only operate according to certain laws. What they did not expect was that the moment the killing intent was revealed, the map-like rune on the torch dragon's forehead would shatter suddenly. At the same time, she let out a sharp scream and could not help but cover her head with her hands. One's consciousness was an extension of their soul. As her consciousness had been killed by Zen, she was in incomparable pain. However, compared to the fear in her heart, this pain was insignificant. As she tried to merge her will with the wills of the great worlds, she was shocked to discover that there was another foreign will. The other will seemed to be existing there from before. How was this possible? Her mind was reeling now. The sorcerer race had spent countless years and sacrificed a lot to plan this. Their goal was to subtly gain control of the entire heavens. Innumerable strategies were put in action, countless days and nights were spent without rest, and finally, this devious plan was hatched. Starting from the lower world of the universe, the torch dragon's will would gradually spread to the entire universe and finally reach the stars. That was the ultimate goal. The sorcerer race overcame the manifold difficulties in executing this plan in rapid succession. One such hurdle was that they needed 1 million insight crystals to achieve their goal. These insight crystals were like the most precious treasures. They were used to cultivate one's soul. They were widely used in the divine land. These crystals were formed in the dark depths of the earth. They took many years to form completely in order to be usable. The process took about 4 to 5 billion years. It was no mean feat. The most frustrating part was that when the last round of Grand Era was destroyed, the insight crystals that they had painstakingly nurtured had been demolished too. Billions of years of perseverance had been destroyed just like that. However, the sorcerer race had not given up. They had persevered and started from scratch, and patiently nurtured the crystals once more. In this way, the sorcerer race was the same as the celestial position race. The grand schemes of both races were recorded in their blood and were inherited by their kin. Every member from each generation would contribute to the progress of their respective plans in order to complete an unimaginable feat. It was all about teamwork here. All the windstorms would escalate at the same time, which would create a false will to fuse with the wills of the great worlds. When that time came, the torch dragon and the other sacred beasts as well as the supreme sorcerers of the sorcerer race would be able to connect with the great worlds and become their actual masters. Only then would they be endowed with the strength required to fight against the supreme lords, and only then would they have the qualifications to compete with the celestial position race. For the sake of this mission, they even pretended to attack the entire universe, launching devastating attacks on some of the sacred places of the 100,000 supreme worlds. At the same time, they also spread the rumor that they were awakening the vicious beasts of the universe, while their real plans made significant headway. However, when they were feigning the attacks on the supreme worlds, they made a crucial mistake and were forced into the lower world by Letitia and her group. The sorcerer race happened to be plotting something in that great world. Coincidentally, thanks to Zen, Master Fang's attention was drawn to Letitia's whereabouts too. The sorcerer race was worried that their plan would be foiled, so they had no choice but to set their plan in motion ahead of time. They succeeded in their plan despite these supreme lords. However, before the false will spread and managed to fuse with the wills of the great worlds, Zen had already merged with the will of one of the great worlds. Nobody in the sorcerer race saw this coming. And now that the false will had been diffused, Zen had become the sole controller of all of the great worlds. The torch dragon had failed miserably. This was an intolerable setback for the sorcerer race. After Zen crushed the torch dragon's consciousness, he quickly discovered that there were some more powerful strange streams of consciousness, which were still attempting to merge with the wills of the great worlds. These streams of consciousness belonged to either the sacred beasts from the sorcerer race hiding in the great worlds, or supreme sorcerers. Zen simply would not tolerate the intrusion of these streams of consciousness. When this thought crossed his mind, the wills of the great worlds gave birth to a series of murderous intents, which completely annihilated all these streams of consciousness. And so, in addition to the torch dragon, the supreme sorcerers also experienced extreme pain. They also discovered that there was an abominable soul hidden within the wills of the great worlds. "Who was that guy?" roared all the supreme sorcerers of the sorcerer race at the same time. Dissatisfaction, anger, disappointment and helplessness, these were the emotions reverberating from the back of the great worlds. The strange expressions on Master Fang's as well as the rest of the supreme lords' faces slowly turned into relieved smiles. They had already known about the sorcerer race's plans. Just a moment ago, they were extremely worried. After all, once all the great worlds were under the sorcerer race's control, they would be on the defensive. But now, they were witnessing the defeat of the torch dragon with triumphant smiles. The supreme lords were also rather confused. Judging by the torch dragon's pitiful cry, it seemed that her soul had been damaged badly, so apart from them, who in the universe could possibly harm her? In their confusion, these supreme lords began to attack the torch dragon. The torch dragon had already taken the human form, and her power was much weaker now. If she fused with the wills of the great worlds, these supreme lords would have no chance of defeating her. But now, all her hopes had turned to ashes, and in the end, she was beheaded by Supreme Lord of Oracle. The flame on her head continued to blaze. The candle dragon's fire was considered to be a rare one, so they obviously wouldn't extinguish it. Even after the torch dragon had been dead for many years, the flame would still continue to burn brightly. The sorcerer race has actually devised a method to seize the heavens. That's really amazing, Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment sighed. The blessed Buddha land led by him was powerful, but they were unable to come up with a plan like this. But what happened? Why did the torch dragon fail? Master Feng shook his head. He was also puzzled by the killing intent that arose in the great worlds. After pondering for a long while, he came to a conclusion. It's possible that a traitor has appeared within the sorcerer race. One of them has fused with the wills of the great worlds and rejected the other wills. This was the only hypothesis Master Feng could make based on the clues at hand. How could he have known that someone else had fused with the wills of the great worlds and was now controlling them? And that person was not a member of the sorcerer race. It was none other than Zen. Chapter 1457, Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. Zen stayed in the void for a long time. Several streams of different powerful consciousness successively launched attacks against the will of the great worlds, but Zen blocked and annihilated all of them in one go. There were a staggering total of 45 attacks that were aimed at the will of the great worlds. Some of the streams of consciousness evidently came from the same person. Afraid to be killed by Zen, they focused all their effort and attacked at rapid successions to gain a solid foothold within the will of the great worlds. However, their efforts were in vain. There were 1,033 great worlds' wills that fused together, which worked to Zen's advantage and had been taken for his own uses. Who knew just how powerful this new fused will was? Even if those streams of consciousness were as strong and mighty as Supreme Lords, just a mere thought from Zen was enough to crush all of them like pesky ants under his boots. They stood no chance against his prowess. The destruction of the consciousness had caused great damages to the souls that had sent out the consciousness. After Zen killed the streams of consciousness over and over, the souls that were initially unwilling to give up finally saw how futile their attempts had been and stopped. It didn't take long before the great world fell into silence. Those guys must have come from the sorcerer race, Zen analyzed with deep calmness. With undivided attention, he tried to search through the memories of the great world's will to pin down the location of the creatures that launched the attacks, but the memories that came out were completely blank and gave him no substantial information. These people were definitely not aboriginals of the great worlds, and they could not be Master Feng or the other supreme lords with him either. The only one whom he suspected that was most likely to have done it was the sorcerer race. After the attack ceased, Zen continued to move forward in the void. He traveled all the way without rest until he reached the location of the chaotic ocean of stars. The area behind it, he noted, was completely bare and empty. Zen originally thought this was the lair of the sorcerer race, but now, he found that there were no living creatures existing here. Could it be that they had already been cleared by Master Feng and the others? Of course, he did not know that in order to spread the fake will, all the sorcerer race members had already sacrificed themselves. Even the tower that originally existed there had been burnt to ashes. Oblivious to that information, Zen opened a crack and entered the space on the front side of this world. He didn't expect that what awaited outside the crack was a calm and peaceful scenery. Is this still the chaotic ocean of stars? Zen asked, stunned and completely at a loss for words. The storm that had been ravaging in the skies above the chaotic ocean of stars for countless years had vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there. A gentle wave slowly lapped at Zen's feet. The sea, which was once angry and relentless, seemed to have calmed down. Zen had already guessed that the great world's wills had relied on storms to spread. Now that all of the wills of the great worlds had fused and merged into one, the storm's mission was finally over. Although Master Feng and the others were nowhere to be found and Zen couldn't find them through the will of the great worlds, he assumed that the Supreme Lords had the situation under control, considering how peaceful the great world was so far. Thinking of this, Zen's shoulders sagged in relief and he let out a long breath. The reason why he didn't want to leave with the other godly geniuses was because he was afraid that the entire central region would be destroyed. If the Supreme Lords were able to suppress the sorcerer race, then Zen could finally rest his mind. Zen circled around the sea and saw a few ferocious beasts coming out from the depths of the ocean floor now that the storm had stopped. Like him, they seemed to be confused why the chaotic ocean of stars suddenly turned calm. Some of the beasts discovered Zen, but after they took a glimpse of him and noticed his cultivation level, they returned to the sea without further incident. Zen's aura was a clear message that he was not someone they could trifle with. Not long after, Zen returned to the central region. Due to what had happened before, all of the people in the central region were in a state of panic, and when Zen killed the consciousness of the powerful warriors of the sorcerer race, he had released strong waves of killing intent, which made the people in the central region panic even more. Everyone was paralyzed with fear, as if the apocalypse was about to knock on their doors. The people of the great world didn't know what the heavens were really like. They created their own legends and understanding of them based on their own cultures. However, the invisible killing intent he spread had caused a large portion of them to sink into fear and assume the worst. The Cloud Hall was remarkably empty, too. The huge cloudy city, which was once buzzing with life, felt like an abandoned ghost city now. Even the martial artists, in fear of what was to come, had run for their own lives, and the ordinary people had more reasons to do so as they brought their families out to flee. The sense of crisis had spread from top to bottom, quickly reaching everyone and inciting mass panic, which drove the people to pack up and leave. Only after returning to the Cloud Hall did Zen activate the token of mountain and release all those who had been hiding in the fairy palace. Seeing that the Cloud Hall was not damaged, Letitia and the rest also let out a sigh of relief. In the end, it was just a false alarm. If the Supreme Lords had really fought here, even 100 central regions would not be enough for them to destroy. However, Zen himself didn't know that it was because he had fused with the Great World's will that he managed to stop the Torch Dragon from fusing with the Great World's will. Otherwise, it would be hard to say how everything could have ended. After all, if the Torch Dragon had fused with the will of the Great Worlds, it would inevitably fight the Supreme Lords regardless of whether it could defeat them or not. Since the Torch Dragon knew how to fuse with the will of the Great Worlds, it definitely knew how to transfer the strength. In fact, it might even have a much richer knowledge of how to use the will of the Great Worlds than Zen. If the Torch Dragon took the Supreme Lords' attacks and transferred the power to this Great World, then it wouldn't have taken long before this Great World faced its doom. Soon, Letitia summoned back all the disciples that had been dismissed and reorganized the Cloud Hall with careful, thorough plans. Not long after, Supreme Lord Mirage reappeared in the Cloud Hall and informed Zen that Master Feng and the other Supreme Lords had returned to the Supreme Worlds. In the same breath, he also informed him of the situation in the universe. Currently, the entire universe went up in arms and made several actions to wipe out the sorcerer race. Under the leadership of Supreme Lord of Original Sin, they went from one supreme world to another, to hunt down the supreme sorcerers, which caused the sorcerer race to nearly disintegrate. The trouble brought about by the sorcerer race had caused terrible chaos in the universe, but with the help of many Supreme Lords, it was diminished and suppressed. Actually, what's more important is the battle with the Torch Dragon. These fellows wanted to steal the heavens, but something seems to have happened. As we speak, Master Feng is still tracking down the person who fused with the world's will, Supreme Lord Mirage informed Zen. Upon hearing it, Zen schooled his expression to keep his face straight, but his chest burst with a strange, unfathomable feeling. Wasn't he the one who had fused with the world's will? Supreme Lord Mirage couldn't read what Zen had on his mind. He was sent here on the orders of Master Feng to tell Zen to come back to the celestial position in time and enter the divine refinement forbidden land. The sorcerer race was not the biggest threat from the start. The most powerful threat came from the other side of the Sighing Wall, and the Sighing Wall could be broken down any moment. So the godly geniuses must improve their cultivation as soon as possible to prepare for the worst. A few days later, all the disciples had come back to the Cloud Hall upon Letitia's summons. Once they were all gathered, she announced her intent and passed the position of leadership to Morphans. Subsequently, Zen took Jeffrey and his wives to the fairy palace, and then he activated the teleportation token again. He was more than ready to return to the supreme world where the celestial position was. Although the teleportation token was extremely convenient and could allow Zen to travel freely, there was a problem at hand. It was difficult for him to pinpoint the exact location, whether it was in the supreme world he wanted to go or in the great world. Fortunately, it wasn't that difficult to move in the Great World through flying because the Great World wasn't very large to begin with. And with Zen's current speed, it wouldn't take him too much time to cross it. But it was a different case with the Supreme World. No matter where he landed in the Supreme World, it would still be very far from his destination. This time, he encountered the same problem. Zen had been sent to the edge of the Supreme World, which frustrated him to no end. If he couldn't find the ascending passageway right away, even if he traveled at the maximum speed, it would still take him at least half a year to reach his destination. Helpless and left with no other choice, Zen could only resort to the roaring token to call for help. When Zen finally returned to the celestial position, the 10 godly geniuses were finally reunited. Zen noticed that Nathan's originally blind eyes had now recovered. One other thing that changed was Nathan's behavior toward him. His strong hostility toward Zen was gone, probably because he had saved Nathan before. Zen smiled, pleased at the turn of events. Chapter 1458. The Titles of the Godly Geniuses. The existence of these 10 godly geniuses was imperative to the entire universe. With their talents, they would eventually grow to become world lords and then break through the limitation of the heavens. However, not much time was left to do so. Some supreme lords had determined that it would take some more time for their enemies to break through the sighing wall. This could take 100 years or even 1,000 years, but it could also be achieved within 10 years. The ancient sorcerer race had already taken action, which meant that the other side was prepared. In sending the godly geniuses to the celestial position, the purpose was that they finally landed in the divine refinement forbidden land. It was said that the divine refinement forbidden land did not belong to this universe, but it was not located in the divine land either. Rather, it originated from some special part of the divine land. Even true gods were only capable of constructing their own inner worlds. Only a holy being could construct a true land outside of the divine land. It was said that the holy being who had built the divine refinement forbidden land had a mysterious existence within the divine land. It was not known why he had built it. He did not construct a giant world like the universe to stabilize himself. The divine refinement forbidden land he had built was a cultivation ground. Not only did the divine refinement forbidden land accept creatures from the inner worlds of the great holy beings, which were also the creatures in the universes, newborn creatures from the divine land were also welcome there. True gods had their own descendants, known as newborn creatures. In a sense, the divine land was the true main world. Living beings like Zen, who were born into the inner world of a holy being, belonged to the first level of life. When the vast majority of newborn creatures were born, they spent their time cultivating in the divine refinement forbidden land. It was the land where they could be trained into a true god, after all. And although most of the newborn creatures were descendants of the true gods, it was not easy for them to become true gods themselves. In reality, a vast majority of the newborn creatures were cruelly eliminated. This brutal law applied to the universe, as well as to the divine land. Entering the divine refinement forbidden land is a special occasion for us, the warriors of the universe. I hope you all can seize this chance well. Master Feng reminded Zen and the others as he finished explaining the details of the land. If we are to enter the divine refinement forbidden land, won't we have to pass through the sighing wall and leave the universe? Lucille asked. To the warriors, the sighing wall seemed as if it was the last layer of protection in the universe. If it were so easy to penetrate, would it not be too easy for invaders from the other universes to enter and create havoc? Master Feng understood Lucille instantly. The sighing wall is not how you perceive it to be. It's no real wall, rather it's just a way of filtering those who try to enter it. The stronger a person, the harder it is for him or her to pass through the wall. Lucille seemed confused, so Master Feng continued, furthermore, you will be transferred to the divine refinement forbidden land straight away. All you need to do is cultivate in the divine refinement forbidden land. That place is not the illusion battlefield. After your death, you won't be able to reincarnate, let alone revive. There was no true meaning of reincarnation in this world. Reincarnation of life in the universe began from gradual death, the turning into bones, turning into mud, then turning into a part of the universe, and finally becoming a part of the inner world of the holy being. However, even if the celestial position had the right to enter the divine refinement forbidden land, they would need some time in advance for preparations. After all, it was no easy task to step in there. Zen and the others were told to wait in the core sacred place of the celestial position. While waiting, they could also cultivate in the celestial position's secret lands. In this core sacred place, the ones who had gathered together were naturally the core disciples of the celestial position after the change of blood. These core disciples were considered the most outstanding existences among the many races. After all, the mere fact that they had obtained recognition of the celestial position meant that they were extraordinary. However, they were not comparable to the 10 godly geniuses. Still, Lucille and the others seemed to be in high spirits. They were all too happy to break the records of the secret lands. With their formidable talent and strength, they consecutively broke all sorts of records in the core sacred place, leaving their previous records far behind in a short span of less than 10 days. This caused the other core disciples to fall into despair. Zen did not participate in the cultivation in the core sacred place, but it was not because he had something against the secret lands built by celestial position. After all, many of the methods used by the celestial position had originated from the divine land. Even if the resources in this universe were incomparable to those in the divine land, they had some unique aspects. However, currently Zen was more concerned with the will of the great worlds. Now that Zen knew of the ambitions of the ancient sorcerer race, he knew that they wanted to control the entire heavens. The will of the great worlds was still slowly unfurling, moving through countless flying passageways towards the universe. It seemed that the will would eventually seep in and diffuse into the universe. Was this the so-called control of the heavens? In this way, the effects of the will of the great worlds must not only be related to transfer of strength. A more powerful method probably existed in order to utilize it. Perhaps the ancient sorcerer race possessed that technique, but Zen had no means of inheriting it. He had to realize it by himself alone. At the same time, Zen had another query in his mind. The mysterious girl, Irene, was rumored to be the controller of the heavens. After all, she was well aware of the 128 heavenly destinies. However, now that the will of the great worlds was spreading, why was Irene turning a blind eye to it? Just what role did she play in the battle between these two universes? As of now, Zen could not figure this out, so he avoided his plan of using the roaring token to communicate. Regardless of the situation, Zen did not want the fact that he had fused with the will of the great worlds to be exposed. Zen calmed down and began cultivating during this period of time. One day, Zen saw Nathan and the others come over together, talking amongst themselves heartily. They were still too young. In fact, with their level of talent, cultivating in the secret lands of celestial position would not make too big of a difference to them. What they enjoyed were the records they created. When a record was broken, the core sacred place warriors mourned in grief, fearing that the new and stupendous records would not be surpassed in this grand era. Zen, do you want to give it a try? The corners of Lawson's mouth quirked up as he stared at Zen. Zen was seated atop a tall pavilion, facing a lush and verdant mountain region. When he heard Lawson, he turned his head and asked with curiosity, "Try what?" Today we went to the Tower of Illusory. It is known to possess the most accurate test of talent in the universe, Lawson said, laughing. Oh, there's no need for me to try it out, Zen replied calmly. The Tower of Illusory and the Tower of Crystal were similar in terms of structure and function. Since Zen had entered the Tower of Crystal before, he naturally knew that Lawson was referring to the talent tablet in the Tower of Illusory. Roche and the others were also following along. Zen and the rest heard Xenia whisper to Roche, "Your Rikshasa title could be considered the third highest title, and it's even in gold." It's shocking. Only several hundred talents possess the golden titles in the celestial position, only 5 golden celestial position titles, 7 golden Asura titles and 9 golden Rikshasa titles. Nathan is too powerful because he has come to obtain the golden title of the Asura. I'm also powerful, for I'm the golden Rikshasa, Margaret said with a smile, excitement evident on her face. Out of the 10 godly geniuses, only Nathan had obtained the title of the golden Asura. Other than him, Margaret and the others were all golden Rikshasa. Xenia and Carl had obtained their titles in the Tower of Illusory several years ago. For the past few days, Margaret had been tagging along as they tried to cultivate in various secret lands. She didn't stick around Zen this time. Margaret's attention had latched onto Zen again. She was also a bit curious about Zen's talent. Her figure floated lightly and she grabbed Zen's arm, smiling sweetly as she said, "My darling, please go and take the test on the talent tablet, won't you?" Upon hearing her words, Nathan, Roche, Kurt, and the rest all turned to look at Zen. Not many knew that Zen had the title of the Golden Celestial Position. The 3 towers were not linked. However, the head of the Celestial Position race should have known about it. After all, Dorothea and the rest must have reported it back then. You can have a try. It won't take much time, Roche said, smiling. Zen had wanted to refuse, but since the others had already been there, it did not seem like a good idea for him to deny the challenge. Under such circumstances, Zen had no choice but to agree. He was all too familiar with the testing process of the talent tablet. To simply enter it would not take him much time. Chapter 1459, Real Inner World. Standing tall and proud, the structure of the Tower of Illusory was almost identical to the Tower of Sin which Zen had entered. Many core disciples of the Celestial Position race were fighting in combat in the Tower of Illusory. The rules, however, weren't as cruel as the rules in the Tower of Sin. It was believed that a treasure like the Tower of Sin could drive almost all of the races to insanity if it would be placed in a great world, because the competition was too intense, and weak races would surely crumble under the brunt of its cruel rules. When Zen and the others entered, all heads turned to them in curiosity and intrigue. The new disciples of the celestial position race shared the same thoughts and knew that this group of monsters was here to humiliate them. Another difference between the two towers was that the list on the Tower of Illusory's talent tablet was comparably longer than the list on the Tower of Sin's talent tablet. It was because this tower had always been in the upper world and had never been lost. The list of names at the top of the talent tablet didn't change very often. It would usually take over hundreds of years for someone to obtain a title. However, in the short span of a few days, different titles appeared at the top of the list one after another. A string of golden titles lined up on the list in a blinding light, illuminating the tower. The core disciples weren't surprised. In fact, they expected it. They thought if the top 10 martial artists of the younger generation of the universe couldn't obtain a title, then who else could? This time, it was Zen who led a group of people into the Tower of Illusory. Almost all of these core disciples had participated in the illusion battlefield, and many of them had even managed to enter the second stage. Of course, they knew who the person walking in front of them was. After all, Zen was number 1 in the illusion battlefield. Zen also changed his blood. I wonder what sort of title he'll get. I've heard that Zen was accepted by the celestial position race long ago. But he did not enter the Tower of Illusory before. Only a few higher ranks in the celestial position race knew what kind of title Zen had. Not long after, the number of martial artists that followed him increased tenfold as he ascended the floors of the Tower of Illusory. When he reached the 10th floor, the sea of martial artists walking behind him nearly took up all of the space of the entire floor. Under everyone's watchful gaze, Zen opened the door and entered the talent tablet. Initially, Zen was unwilling to enter the talent tablet, but since he had come, he decided to take it seriously. When he entered the talent tablet, everyone held their breath and wondered what kind of title he'd receive. "Zen, you are the best," Margaret told Zen, eager to encourage him. She was full of confidence that Zen could do this. Nathan kept his mouth shut. He had the Golden Asura title, and in his opinion, even though Zen had defeated him, his talent couldn't be stronger than his. Roche and Xenia just watched quietly. Unlike the others, the both of them knew more. For example, they knew that Zen's blood was currently the most special out of all the blood present in the tower. There were only 2 copies of the golden blood in the entire universe. One of them had been used by Master Feng while the last one had been injected into Zen's body. But they could not foresee what title Zen would obtain. It could be a golden celestial position title, Xenia whispered, not knowing that this title had been with Zen for a long time. After approximately 15 minutes had passed, Zen left the talent tablet and turned over his shoulder to look. According to Zen's conjectures, the title on the talent tablet should not have changed at all. It should still be a golden celestial position. At a fast speed, golden-colored spots began to appear on the talent tablet. As the spots changed, they formed into large golden words. The words on the talent tablet were in fact an evaluation from the weapon spirit trapped within the tower. During the early stages of the tower's construction, a very special race was sealed within it. They were called the Heavenly Soul Race. The Heavenly Soul Race was a very common race in the Divine Land, and many powerful weapons had weapon spirits within them. If they were allowed to have their own consciousness, then they could probably make weapons more spiritual. Notably, the soul of Lone's broken sword belonged to the Heavenly Soul Race. The weapon spirit's evaluation was also according to an instruction handed in by the owner of the tower. It was the sole responsibility of the weapon spirit to give different evaluations according to the performances. But this time, the weapon spirit gave him a rather strange title. The words were written in gold, but the line of the words that was displayed on the talent tablet caused the onlookers, including several godly geniuses, to stare in shock, befuddled. The words said, "You are the only one." What kind of a title is this? How the heck can this be a title? Is there something wrong with this lousy tower? Or is there something wrong with the weapon spirit inside? Honestly speaking, had a golden celestial position title appeared on the talent tablet, everyone wouldn't be this dumbfounded. For the number 1 warrior in the younger generation to obtain the title of golden celestial position was not something unacceptable or unspeakable. On the contrary, it was actually very common and normal. However, many people were not able to decipher the meaning of these words, including Zen himself. Xena's eyes widened as she stared at the large words flashing in gold. In her mind, she guessed that the weapon spirit probably couldn't give him a higher title, so it gave him an evaluation instead. What did it mean by Zen was the only one? Did it mean he was an irreplaceable existence? This evaluation was quite high. She flickered her gaze to Zen, who could only stare at her in confusion. She softened and said, "It might be due to the blood." "Blood," Zen murmured, placing a hand on the skin above his heart. Upon hearing Zena's reminder, Zen was hit by a strike of epiphany, and he seemed to have finally understood what was going on. The blood he exchanged was indeed very special. Was that why this weapon spirit gave him such an evaluation? Zena's analysis might be correct after all. However, this weapon spirit was too straightforward. Soon enough, the news of Zen obtaining such a strange title spread like wildfire in and out of the tower. Many core disciples had already left the Tower of Illusory, and after hearing this news, they all rushed back to see it with their own eyes. As for Zen, he felt like an outsider. His mind was focused on his cultivation and accompanying his women. Although Letitia was arranged to stay in the fairy palace, Zen would bring her and Jeffrey out from time to bond and have fun. Before he knew it, more days passed. Zen had no idea how difficult the divine refinement Forbidden Land was. There weren't any news from Master Feng in the past 2 months. Many supreme lords in the universe maintained their steady communication with each other. They were still going after the remnants of the sorcerer race, because although their plans were destroyed by Zen, a few of their supreme sorcerers still remained, and only the supreme lords were strong enough to fight them. On the other hand, Zen hadn't felt this peaceful in a while. Whenever he got tired from his cultivation, he'd go out and accompany Letitia and Jeffrey or joke with Margaret, who was always by his side. He felt so comfortable and serene that he considered living this kind of life for 100 or even 1,000 years. It was such a shame that he had to face the crisis soon enough. That was why some people called their generation a tragedy. In this era, all sorts of super geniuses had appeared. The strength of the younger generation had also advanced by leaps and bounds, and their progresses were countless times faster than before. In the far past, however, if a warrior did not pursue advancement, then he could enjoy life once he reached the Soul Sea realm. Afterward, he could live for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. In this case, it wouldn't be a pity for them to fall into the 5 aging processes in the end. But now, that huge danger was like a knife placed around his neck. All the living creatures in the universe were worried for their safety. There was simply no time to think about the luxuries of life. Despite this, the core disciples of the celestial position race were still very active. In fact, this time, when the sorcerer race suddenly orchestrated an attack, there were already countless rumors spreading throughout the supreme worlds. Many martial artists began to spread the theory of the apocalypse. Those martial artists who were struggling suddenly realized that they no longer had the motivation to advance. Disciples of many sacred places also stopped being active, refusing to advance even in their dreams. All of them had lost their hopes and passion. The apocalypse was about to arrive soon anyway, so what was the point? These martial artists didn't even have the qualifications to struggle in the apocalypse. Why not enjoy the last bits of this short period of time? In the same span of time, Zen's inner world had undergone another change as he cultivated. The time flow rate of the inner world was much different from the time flow rate of the outside. Actually, in this current stage, Zen's inner world still lacked a complete concept of time. In theory, the time flow rate of his inner world should be countless times faster compared to the time flow rate of the universe. As he trained and developed himself further, Zen occasionally used his inner sight to look around. He discovered that some of the more complex life forms had already been born within his inner world. As he looked inside, he noticed that the chaotic sea was teeming with creatures. There were even many giant fishes that slowly swam under the lapping waves. According to the rules of cultivation, after the owner of the inner world died, the creatures within would immediately dissipate into a mass of life vitality. Even a true god was no exception. The only one who could surpass this rule was most likely a holy being. But even a holy being wouldn't be able to bring out any living being from their inner world. It was simply impossible. Leaving the inner world of a holy being was crossing the heavens and leaving the universe. Only these godly geniuses could do such an impossible feat. If a supreme lord were to forcefully leave this universe, they would die and turn into the life vitality in an instant. At this very moment, while he was swimming in his own thoughts, a little fish suddenly materialized in Zen's hand. Chapter 1460, The Invaders. Observing the small fish in his hand, Zed was momentarily stunned. Creatures formed from life vitality would be restored to life vitality once they moved to the external world. As per this law, since this little fish had been removed from the external world by Zen, it was bound to be converted into chaotic energy. However, the scales of this little fish continued to remain bright silver. Also, the strong stench of the fish persevered. The little fish struggled in Zen's hand for a while. But soon, Zen tossed it gently into the air. It drew an arc in the air and landed in the pond beneath the pavilion, splashing water. Once again it began to swim freely. According to Zen's current understanding, the universe was one level higher than the ordinary inner world. Whether people use the visualization technique to visualize treasures or used life vitality to nurture creatures within the inner world, in the end, they would all return to their original state. This was because cultivation was originally meant to seize heaven and earth, and now was the time to return heaven and earth back to heaven and earth where they ultimately belonged. As for chaotic energy, there was no point in returning it. That was not a product of the heavens and didn't need to be returned. Thinking of this, Zen began to sigh in his heart. He had never anticipated that crossing the heavens would be such a complex matter. For the creatures of the universe, they had to become godly geniuses in order to cross the heavens and enter the divine land. This was because this was the inner world of a holy being. After leaving the inner world, they would return to life vitality. The life vitality of a holy being was seized from the divine land, so naturally it had to be returned to the divine land. Even a supreme lord who had forcefully left the universe would be turned into life vitality, dissipating within the divine land. However, Zen's fish would not be affected by this restriction. Moreover, all the living creatures within Zen's inner world could cross the heavens, regardless of strength or cultivation. This was because these creatures came from the chaos. Hold on. Suddenly, an important question popped into Zen's head. If everything in the universe would dissipate into life vitality, then what about Yan? What will happen to her? He wondered. After being deep in thoughts, the answer finally occurred to him. Without a doubt, Yan was a creature of the universe. When she had left, she was still young, and her cultivation was not high. It was impossible for her to become a godly genius, let alone a true god. There is not even a chance for her to become a true god, he realized. If it was in the past, Zen might even suspect that Yan had turned into life vitality and disappeared into the divine land. However, Irene had already given him the information and confirmed Yan's location, dispelling his doubts. With the help of this information, Zen seemed pretty positive that the young man who took Yan away could resolve this problem. With a burst of wild thoughts, Zen gradually entered a meditative state and closed his eyes, continuing his cultivation. After a short while, the news finally arrived. It turned out there were still 3 months left until they could be sent to the divine refinement forbidden land. But looking at the brighter side, everything would be ready in these 3 months. The 10 godly geniuses would begin their journey after 3 months. However, these 3 months would in no sense be peaceful. In the first 2 months, 4 supreme lords had perished in the universe. Amongst them, 1 was from the blessed Buddha land, 2 from the Humanity Alliance, and 1 from the Thoughtless Minds. Those that perished were all supreme lords of the human race. However, the supreme sorcerers of the sorcerer race were also exterminated one by one. Besides, they were all exterminated by the supreme lord of original sin, the leader of Xuanyuan clan. In the fight between supreme lords, it was originally extremely difficult to defeat the opponent. As for supreme lord of original sin, he had rooted out 10 supreme sorcerers within a short period of time. His strength became evident to everyone who witnessed his fight. Some of these pieces of news came from Rocher, while others were from the words of supreme lords spread out through roaring tokens. Zen also knew that the reason these supreme lords were showing off their victory was to boost the morale of the warriors in the universe. During those days, the demon knight race remained to keep silence. Shania had found a way to break the rules of the universe, but none of the supreme lords uttered a word about it. On the contrary, the supreme lords of the ogre were especially hardworking, and it was said that whenever the ancient sorcerer race attacked, the ogre race would always be the first to rush in. The more Zen came to see the turn of events, the more worried he became. He realized that he didn't know much about the crisis, and he couldn't control anything. What can I do to get things under control? He thought anxiously. It wasn't the first time Zen was dealing with troubles. In fact, he had faced a lot of obstacles in the past. However, back then he was very clear about where the trouble came from. On top of that, he had good knowledge about how to deal with it. Now, Zen was clutched by a sense of powerlessness, not because he was afraid of these dangers, but because he could not completely grasp all the information. 9 dragons remained to stay shut, so did Lavender. Zen was unable to discriminate the right from the wrong now. The only thing Zen knew with certainty was that the universe was going to face the invaders. As the leader of the top 10 godly geniuses, Zen was obliged to do something to solve this problem. The events of the first 2 months were more than enough to make him realize he had to do something promptly. Originally, he had anticipated the final month to be peaceful, but now, in the midst of all these events, it was destined to be fully chaotic. The universe had no chance of being peaceful. A very startling thing happened in the 3rd month. The unbreakable sighing wall was broken. When 300 ace talents competed on the Heaven-Earth board, the first ace talent to be eliminated was a warrior from the spring race. For a weak race like the spring race to produce an ace talent was already an inconceivable thing. After all, there were very few members of the spring race, and they only occupied 3 poor supreme worlds. Therefore, a supreme lord predicted that this great danger would erupt within the spring race. In the end, it proved that the supreme lord's deduction was correct. When the sighing wall was broken through, the invaders like locusts quickly occupied the territory of the spring race. In no time, the entire clan was completely annihilated. This news exploded in everyone's ears like thunder, shocking the entire universe. Everyone knew that the apocalypse would come soon, but not even in their wildest dreams would they think it would happen this soon. The violent manner in which it happened shook everyone to the core. However, a strange thing happened which further startled everyone. The invaders occupied only the territories of 3 supreme worlds and didn't continue to advance. Zen and the others were also paying close attention to this matter. Since the invaders behind the sighing wall had arrived in a blink of an eye, they wondered if there was still a need for them to enter the divine refinement forbidden land. Half a month later, most of the supreme lords had gathered in the celestial position once again. After occupying 3 supreme worlds, the invaders hadn't yet made any effort to advance into the universe. Instead, they chose a group of representatives to come forth in a grandiose manner. Another unexpected thing happened. It turned out they were actually going to carry out a negotiation with them. Such a piece of news, undoubtedly, began to spread like a wildfire. When this startling news reached Zen and the others, they also felt a bit suspicious. Since these invaders had the power to break through the sighing wall and enter the universe, they couldn't understand why they had asked for a negotiation. What was even more unexpected was that Master Feng actually accepted the negotiation, and the location of the negotiation was decided to be at the Breaking Cloud sacred place of the celestial position. The participants of this negotiation weren't limited to the Supreme Lords, but Zen and the others were also invited. All the powers in the universe expectantly waited for this negotiation. After all, this was related to the fate of the entire universe. If the invaders could be convinced to give up their plans to invade the universe, then that would be the best achievement. However, such a result was unlikely. There was a treasured mountain named Breaking Cloud Mountain in the Breaking Cloud sacred place. All year round, it was covered in profound ice. As a result, the entire body was sparkling and translucent. The beautiful scenery was a sight to behold. Its beauty was so unearthly that at certain times it seemed like an illusion. At the moment, Zen, Roche and the rest had arrived at the summit of Breaking Cloud Mountain. In front of them, over 50 Supreme Lords were gathered. Not long after, a few dazzling lights appeared in the sky. At the same time, an extremely powerful aura exploded forth, as though a certain devil lord had descended into this world, causing people to feel incomparable reverence for him. In front of a Supreme Lord, releasing that aura was just a small trick. Supreme Lord of Original Sin waved his hand simply and that aura disappeared like a wisp of smoke. Ha ha ha, with so many Supreme Lords welcoming me, I, Maha, am truly honored. Following that, a burst of extremely arrogant laughter resounded in the sky. Amongst them, there was a figure that rushed down first. This person was a violet-haired youth. However, this youth was not a Supreme Lord. He was only a World Lord. If an ordinary World Lord acted so arrogantly in front of Supreme Lords, he would inevitably suffer a loss. Amongst the many Supreme Lords on Breaking Cloud Mountain, there were a few ill-tempered Supreme Lords. They frowned and had an urge to teach him a lesson, but they were stopped by Master Feng. Behind Maha were 9 other powerhouses. They were the Supreme Lords of another universe. They are from the sacred race. Zen's eyebrows twitched as he whispered. Lucille asked curiously, what sacred race? A powerful race, replied Zen. When Zen had stepped into the true path in his fairy palace, the opponents whom he had encountered during the assessment were all warriors from the sacred race. According to Saul, the sacred race was the most perfect race, while the demon knight race, the human race, the ogre race paled in comparison. This was because all the humanoid races seemed to be descended from the sacred race. Hence the sacred race had the advantage over many different races. As Maha spoke, he shot downwards at an extremely high speed. The instant his feet hit the ground, a massive crack suddenly burst out from the center of this crystal-clear Breaking Cloud Mountain. Master Feng's face darkened. With a slight push from his feet, the crack once again closed. It seemed like the crack didn't appear all this time. The negotiation was yet to begin, but the two sides seemed to be at loggerheads already. Each one of those present had their own ideas and was wondering what the result would be.